He hit her in the front room of her own family's office, right in front of the clerk who pretended not to see it. Not a shove, not a grab at her arm. A full, open-handed strike across the left side of her face that sent her stumbling into the corner of her father's mahogany desk, the same desk where Chester Hartwell had spent 30 years building something worth passing down. The sound of it was flat and ugly, the kind of sound that doesn't echo so much as settle into a room and stay there. Maribel caught herself on the edge of the desk and didn't fall, which might have been the thing that made her uncle angrier than anything else she'd ever done. "You don't own a single plank of this floor," Gerald Hartwell said. "He wasn't even breathing hard, you never did. If this story already has you gripped, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss what comes next, and hit that like button so this story can travel further than we ever imagined. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. We genuinely want to see how far this tale has reached. Now let's go back to where it all began. Maribel Hartwell was 31 years old the morning she realized she had nothing left. Not nothing in the way people sometimes say it when they mean things are difficult. Nothing in the actual counted cents, $12, folded inside a handkerchief, a suitcase with a broken latch she'd tied shut with rope she found in the barn, and the clothes she was standing in. The bruise on her left cheekbone had turned the color of a plum overnight, and when she pressed her fingertips to it in the small mirror above the wash basin at the boarding house, she felt the tenderness run all the way to her back teeth. She had slept 3 hours, maybe less. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and tried to think clearly. The morning light came in pale and flat through the gap in the curtain, and she watched the dust move in it and tried to make a list in her head of what she still had that was real and true and couldn't be taken. She was good with numbers. She had been keeping her father's books since she was 16 years old. She could cook. She could manage a household. She could stretch a dollar until it screamed. She was not fragile, even if the bruise on her face said otherwise. Her father had been dead 11 days. 11 days, and Gerald had moved so fast it had made her head spin. She had not understood at first how thoroughly her uncle had prepared for this. The revised partnership papers had already been drawn up. The notary had already been paid. The clerk at the county recorder's office, a thin, pale man named Finch, who always smelled of hair oil, had already processed the transfer of the business registration into Gerald's name alone. By the time Maribel had even thought to look for the original deed to the building, it was gone from the strongbox where her father kept it. "I don't know what you're looking for," Gerald had said, standing in the doorway of the office while she searched. "But you should know that your father and I had a private agreement before he got sick. He didn't want to burden you with it. My father told me everything about this business," Maribel said. She was still looking through the desk drawer, pulling out ledger books and correspondence and stacking them on the surface. "He told me every supplier, every debt, every contract. He told me what he paid the men. He told me what the building was worth. He never mentioned any agreement with you." "He wouldn't," Gerald said, and his voice had that particular softness that certain men use right before they say something designed to hurt. "He loved you. He didn't want you to feel like a burden." She had looked up at him then. "What does that mean?" "It means you were never going to inherit this business, Maribel. You're not capable of running it. Your father knew that. He just didn't have the heart to say it to your face." Gerald folded his hands. "But I'm willing to let you stay on. Help with the filing. Keep the books organized the way you always have. There's a room in the back you could use." She had stared at him. "A room in the back," she repeated. "It would be comfortable enough." "You're offering me a closet," she said. "In the business my father built. For working for you for free. I'm offering you a place to stay," Gerald said, and there was something shifting in his expression now. Something that told her the pleasant version of this conversation was almost over. "You don't have a lot of options, Maribel. A woman your age, your situation. You should think carefully about what you're walking away from." She had thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "I won't be staying," she said, and started gathering the ledger books she'd brought herself, the ones she'd maintained in her own hand over the last 4 years. That was when Gerald stepped fully into the room and took hold of her wrist. "Those belong to the business," he said. "These are in my handwriting. I kept them. Everything in this office belongs to the business," Gerald said. "Which belongs to me. Put them down." She tried to pull her arm back. He tightened his grip, and she realized with a cold, dropping sensation in her stomach that he was stronger than she'd ever considered. He was not a large man, Gerald, but he was wiry and his grip was the kind that left marks. "Let go of me," she said, and he hit her. The clerk, a young man named Darby, who had worked for her father for 2 years, was sitting at his desk not 8 feet away. Maribel heard the scrape of his chair as he pushed back from it, but when she looked up from where she'd caught herself against the mahogany desk, Darby was already looking at the floor. His pen was in his hand. He had decided, in the space of a breath, that he had not seen anything. Her face was ringing. Her vision had gone strange at the edges for a moment, and she gripped the desk and waited for it to settle. Gerald smoothed the front of his jacket. "You've been stealing from this business for years," he said. "I have documentation. I've already spoken to a lawyer. If you make any kind of trouble, if you go to anyone with any kind of claim, I will see to it that you are prosecuted for fraud. Do you understand me?" She didn't say anything. She was still trying to make her vision come back right. "Do you understand me, Maribel?" "I understand you," she said. She left without the ledgers. She sat on the train west for 3 days and tried to calculate what she was moving toward. Virginia had become impossible. Gerald's accusation about the books had spread faster than she could have anticipated. That was the thing about small business communities she'd learned. People talked. And when the story was that a woman had been cooking her deceased father's accounts, people believed it because it was a comfortable kind of story. It confirmed what a lot of people already suspected about women who involved themselves in business matters. She had gone to 2 people she thought might help her and found them polite and distant and clearly already decided. She chose Montana because she'd read that the territory was expanding, that ranches and settlements were growing, that there was work for people willing to do it. She was not naive enough to think it would be simple, but she was practical enough to understand that staying in a place where her name was already ruined accomplished nothing. Red Willow was smaller than she'd expected. She stepped off the train on a Tuesday afternoon and stood on the platform with her rope-bound suitcase and looked at the main street and tried to calculate the situation. 2 general stores, a hotel, a barber, a bank that looked newly built, a sheriff's office, a feed and grain merchant, half a dozen other storefronts in various stages of permanence. She started at the hotel. The man at the front desk looked her over in the particular way. She had grown accustomed to the quick, comprehensive assessment that started at her face and moved downward and arrived at a conclusion before she'd said a word. She had learned to recognize it. She had also learned to speak before it could fully settle into a decision. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Housekeeping, cooking, bookkeeping, managing household accounts. I have 4 years of experience maintaining full business records." The hotel man's name was Greer, according to the sign on the desk. He had a narrow face and the expression of someone who had made up his mind. "We're not hiring," he said. "Could you recommend someone who might be?" He had already looked back at his ledger. "Can't think of anyone." She went to the general stores. She went to the bank and asked to speak to the manager and was told by a young woman at a desk that the manager was unavailable. She found a notice board near the post office with work listings and copied down 3 addresses on a scrap of paper. 2 of the addresses turned out to be for jobs already filled. The third was a farmhouse on the edge of town where a woman named Mrs. Pruitt needed someone to help with laundry 3 days a week for 30 cents a day. Maribel stood at Mrs. Pruitt's door and did the arithmetic in her head. 30 cents a day, 3 days a week, 90 cents a week. She had $12. At 90 cents a week, accounting for food and the cheapest room she'd found advertised at the boarding house on Crane Street, she would be out of money in roughly 10 weeks, and she would not have built toward anything. "I can do more than laundry," she told Mrs. Pruitt. "I can cook, manage accounts, organize a household." "It's laundry I need," Mrs. Pruitt said. She was a sharp-faced woman who kept looking past Maribel toward the road, as though she was expecting someone more promising to come along. "I'll take it," Maribel said. She worked 3 days for Mrs. Pruitt. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Pruitt told her she'd found someone else, a girl from a nearby homestead who would do it for 20 cents a day, and thanked Maribel for her time. Maribel walked back to the boarding house on Crane Street and sat at the small table in her room and looked at the money she had left and added up what she'd spent on food and her room and came out with $9.40. She was burning through it faster than she'd planned. She went back to the general stores. She went to the feed merchant and asked if there was accounting work needed. She was told no. She heard from the boarding house owner, a tired woman named Mrs. Foles, that the school teacher position had been filled 2 months ago. She asked at the laundry if they needed help, and was told they were fully staffed. She walked the length of the main street twice in one morning and tried every door that looked like it might belong to a business and came away with nothing. On the 5th day, she heard from another boarder, a traveling salesman named Hutchins, who was friendly in an uncomplicated way, that there was a ranch east of town called the Blackwood Place. Large operation. Run by one man? Maribel asked. Hutchins poured himself more coffee from the pot on the table and considered the question. The kind people talk about without knowing much. Keeps to himself. Had a falling out with most of the town council 2 years back about a water issue, something like that. Nobody goes out there much. He's not known for being welcoming. Is he known for being honest? Hutchins looked at her over the rim of his cup. Far as anybody knows. Why? I'm going to ask him for work, she said. Hutchins set down his cup. Ma'am, I don't mean this unkindly, but I've heard that man ran off the last 2 people who came to his ranch unannounced. One was trying to sell him equipment, and one was a county assessor. I'll keep that in mind, Maribel said. She walked to the Blackwood Ranch on a Thursday morning when the sky was overcast and the temperature had dropped enough that she could feel it through her coat. The road east of town was unpaved and in poor condition, and by the time she'd covered what she estimated was 4 miles, her good shoes had taken on enough dust that they'd changed color. The ranch property began where a weathered post stood at the side of the road with no name on it, just a chain across a dirt track. She unhooked the chain, walked through and hooked it behind her. The track wound up a low rise, and when she came over it, she saw the main house below, a solid 2-story structure built from timber and stone, a long barn to the left, a series of outbuildings, and a corral where 3 horses stood in the gray morning light. A man was working at the corral fence with a hammer. He'd heard her coming, or sensed her somehow, because he'd already turned and was watching her walk down the track before she was close enough to speak. She had made a decision about this before she left the boarding house. She would not apologize for showing up. She would not give him a long preamble or explain everything that had brought her here before asking the actual question. She would ask the question plainly and let him answer it. She stopped at a respectful distance from the corral. My name is Maribel Hartwell, she said. I'm looking for work. Cook, manage a household, keep accounts, and organize the sort of paperwork that tends to pile up when there's nobody specifically assigned to it. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for fair wages, and I won't be any trouble. The man Elias Blackwood, she was almost certain, because he matched the description Hutchins had given her as best she could interpret. It looked at her without speaking for a long moment. He was somewhere north of 40, lean and weathered in the particular way of men who worked outdoors in hard climates. He had gray coming in at his temples and jaw. His eyes were a light color that she couldn't determine in the overcast morning. Ranch isn't hiring, he said. His voice was flat and direct, and told her nothing about what he was thinking. Would you be willing to tell me why? She asked. He seemed mildly surprised by the question. Don't need the help. Your household accounts are piled on a desk with no organization, she said, which was a guess, but a calculated one. Your barn could use repair work on the eastern wall by the look of the boards from here. You have 3 horses, but I see 6 stall posts in the corral, which suggests you had more animals once and don't anymore. I don't know what happened to the others, but if it's a financial question, that's something I might be able to help with. He stared at her. You got all that from the road, he said. I was an accountant's daughter, she said. I was trained to observe. He came out of whatever brief calculation he'd been doing, and his expression closed back down. I don't need a housekeeper, he said. Good day, miss. Hartwell, she said. And I haven't eaten today. She hadn't planned to say that. She had planned to say thank you for his time and turn and walk back down the road toward Red Willow and figure out what to try next. But the words came out anyway, and once they were in the air between them, she couldn't do anything about it. He went very still, not the stillness of a man who hadn't heard, the stillness of a man who had heard something he was deciding what to do with. He looked at her face, then really looked at it, and she watched his gaze settle on her left cheekbone, where the bruise had faded from plum to a yellowish green that she'd tried to cover with powder and had not fully succeeded. How long ago did that happen? He asked. 11 days, she said. He didn't ask who did it. He just nodded once, as though confirming something he'd already supposed. Come inside, he said. I'll find you something to eat. She followed him across the yard and up the porch steps and through the front door, and what she saw inside the house was not a disaster, exactly. but the specific kind of disorganized neglect that develops when a capable person has been managing a large operation alone for too long, and the household has simply fallen to the bottom of the priority list. Mail stacked on the entry table. Dishes done but stacked carelessly. A good fireplace with ash that needed clearing. And, visible through the door to what appeared to be a study or office, exactly what she had guessed. Papers and ledger books in a state that made her fingers itch. He fed her. Bacon and bread and coffee and dried apple, set down on the kitchen table without ceremony or comment. She ate it all and did not pretend otherwise. He sat across the table from her and drank his own coffee and watched her with those pale eyes and didn't speak until she had put her fork down. "Where are you from?" he said. "Virginia," she said. "My father had a dry goods business. I kept his accounts for 4 years. What happened to the business?" She considered how much to say. She had found, in the last 11 days, that when she tried to explain too much of it up front, people got that particular expression that said they were waiting for the part where it became her fault. So she said the short version instead. "My father died. His brother took control before the estate could be settled. I left." Elias looked at the side of her face. "Did the brother do that?" "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee cup down and looked at the table and then back at her. "I can pay $7 a month," he said, "plus room and board. There's a room off the kitchen that's been empty for 2 years. You'd eat with the household. I've got 4 ranch hands. Hank Mercer's been here the longest, nearly 6 years. The other 3 come and go with the season. Cooking for 6, cleaning the house, and organizing that." He glanced toward the office door. "Whatever that is in there, that's what I'd need. $7 a month and room and board." It was less than she'd hoped for. It was more than she had. "I'll want access to the household accounts," she said. "If I'm going to cook and manage supplies, I need to know what we're working with." "All right," he said. "And I'd like it clear from the start that if I see something in the books that concerns me, I'll say so." He looked at her steadily. "That would be fine." "Then I accept," she said. He stood up and nodded once and picked up his coffee cup. "Room's through that door on the left," he said. "There's a hook for your coat. Supper's usually at 6. She carried her rope-bound suitcase through the kitchen door and found the room that had been empty for 2 years narrow but clean enough, with a window that looked out toward the barn, and a bed frame with a mattress that was better than anything she'd slept on since leaving Virginia. She set the suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her fingertips to the bruise on her cheek and breathed. She was not safe, she understood that. She was in a strange man's house in a territory she didn't know, with $9.40 and no allies, and a name that her uncle had done his best to dirty. She was not anywhere close to safe, but the door had opened instead of closed. And for right now, in this particular moment, that was enough to work with. She started the next morning before sunrise. That was a deliberate decision. She'd been in enough situations to know that the fastest way to settle the question of whether she could handle the work was to without announcement, without asking anyone to watch, without making it into a demonstration. She got up in the dark and built the kitchen fire and started the coffee and had bacon on before she heard the first of the ranch hands moving around in the bunkhouse outside. The man who came in first was Hank Mercer, which she knew because of the way he moved not tentatively, the way a newer man might be in someone else's kitchen, but with the particular ease of someone who had been using this space for years. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with a broad, square face and hands that looked like they'd been built for a larger man and just delivered to Hank by mistake. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. "Morning," she said. He looked at her, looked at the stove, looked at the coffee pot. "Morning," he said. After a beat, he poured himself coffee and went and sat at the far end of the table, and she could feel him watching her back with the particular focused attention of a man conducting an evaluation he thought was invisible. The other 3 hands came in within the next 20 minutes, 2 younger men named Cole and Watts, and a quiet, older Mexican man named Ruiz, who nodded to her and said nothing and went straight to the coffee. She fed all 4 of them, and then went to Elias's study, while the breakfast settled in and stood in the doorway, looking at the situation. The situation was considerable. There were 5 distinct stacks of paper and correspondence on the desk surface, plus 2 ledger books that had been left open. A 3rd ledger book was on the floor beside the desk. The bottom drawer of the desk was hanging partially open because it was too stuffed with papers to close properly. There were receipts mixed in with contracts, which were mixed in with what looked like personal correspondence, which were mixed in with a cattle's registry, and what appeared to be several years' worth of seed invoices. She rolled up her sleeves and started. By midday, she had sorted everything into categories and made an inventory of what was present. By the time she had to stop to start supper, she had a clear picture of the ranch's incoming and outgoing money for the past 3 years, and that picture was generating a small but persistent unease that she filed away in the back of her mind and decided to return to. Elias came into the kitchen while she was starting the evening meal and stood in the doorway, in the same way she had stood in his office doorway, looking at the situation before committing to entering it. "You move things," he said. "I organize things," she said. "Everything is labeled. You can find anything you need." "I could find things before," he said. "You could find things eventually," she said. "Now you can find things directly." He was quiet. She half expected him to be annoyed, but when she glanced at him over her shoulder, his expression was closer to something she couldn't quite read. "All right," he said, and went back out. By the end of her first week, Hank Mercer's evaluation was still ongoing. She could tell because he found small reasons to be in or near the kitchen during hours when there was no obvious reason for him to be there. She could tell also because he watched her carry things, not waiting for her to fail at it. Exactly, but noting how she managed weight and logistics, and whether she asked for help. She did not ask for help. She had been carrying things longer than most people gave her credit for. On the 8th day, she was splitting wood behind the house. She'd found the woodpile was getting low, and the axe was right there when Hank came around the corner of the house and stopped. He watched her take 2 more swings. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and split another piece. He stood there a moment longer. Then he picked up the axe from where she'd leaned it against the block and split the next piece himself and handed it off to her to stack. They did it that way, without discussing it, for the next 20 minutes, until the pile was done. "Where'd you learn to swing an axe?" he asked. "My father's woodyard," she said. He was short-staffed every winter. Hank looked at the stacked wood. "You're stronger than you look," he said. "Most people are," she said. Something shifted in his expression then, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. He picked up the axe and went back around the corner of the house, and after that he stopped watching her back from across the kitchen and started looking at her face instead when she talked, which was a different kind of attention entirely and considerably more useful. She went back to the ledgers on the 9th day with a focused intention. The unease she had filed away in the back of her mind had been waiting patiently for her, and now she let it come forward. She sat at Elias's desk. He had started letting her use it during the hours he was out on the property, and opened the ledger books in chronological order and started going through the income and expenditure entries, line by line. The cattle and hay income was exactly what it should be. Consistent, traceable, matching the size of the herd and acreage she'd been able to observe. The expenditures on equipment, feed, and wages all checked out against the receipts she'd sorted. But there were payments quarterly, consistent, going back almost 4 years to something listed only as Ironwood L&D. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were regular. $50, $60, once $80. Always Ironwood L&D. Never explained. Never cross-referenced to any receipt in the pile she'd sorted. She wrote the name down on a separate piece of paper and looked at it. Ironwood Land and Development. She had not heard that name in the week she'd been in Red Willow, which was itself a small thing worth noting. A business that collected regular payments from a ranch this size ought to have some kind of visible presence. She put the paper in her pocket and kept working. 2 days later, she was in the Red Willow General Store picking up supplies when she heard the name for the first time. 2 men at the front counter, talking with the store owner, and the word Ironwood passed between them in the particular low way that people use when they're discussing something they've already agreed is serious. She finished selecting her items and went to the counter and paid, and while she was counting out coins, she said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hear. But did you mention Ironwood?" The men looked at her. The store owner looked at her. "Ironwood Land and Development," she said. "I was just curious. I've seen the name in correspondence." The older of the 2 men at the counter said, "Silas Crow's outfit," in the tone of someone naming something unpleasant. "Who is Silas Crow?" she asked. The store owner busied himself with something below the counter. The 2 men exchanged a glance. "Man who owns a lot of this valley," the younger one said carefully. "One way or another." She thanked them and took her supplies and walked out to the wagon, and the piece of paper in her pocket felt suddenly heavier than paper should. Silas Crow came to the Blackwood Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon near the end of Maribel's third week, and she had just enough warning to learn his face before he came to the door. She'd been in the yard carrying a bucket when she heard the sound of a carriage coming up the track. Not a working carriage, Ed. The kind people used to haul things, but the kind with good wheels and fresh paint and a driver who sat straight. She stopped and watched it come over the rise, and when it stopped in the yard, the man who stepped out was not what she'd expected, and entirely what she should have expected. He was well dressed in the fashion of a city man temporarily visiting the frontier. Not young past 50, she estimated, but with the kind of careful, maintained appearance that speaks of money spent on the impression of vigor. Silver-streaked hair, a good coat. He looked at the ranch property the way buyers look at things they have already decided to own. He looked at her with considerably less interest. "I'm here to see Elias Blackwood," he said. "I'll let him know," she said. She found Elias in the barn and told him there was a man in the yard who'd arrived in a painted carriage and wanted to see him, and she described him briefly. Elias's expression did not change, exactly, but something around his eyes tightened in a way she was starting to learn to read. "Crow," he said, "is that a problem?" "Has been for a while," he said, and walked out of the barn. She did not follow them. She went to the kitchen window instead, which gave her a partial view of the yard. And she watched the conversation without being able to hear it. It lasted nearly 20 minutes. Crow's posture throughout was relaxed and confident. Elias's was not relaxed, but it was steady, the posture of a man who had decided what he was not going to do, and was simply waiting for the other man to finish making his case for it. When Crow left the painted carriage, turning around in the yard and heading back down the track, Elias came into the kitchen and stood for a moment with his back to the room. "He wants to buy the ranch," he said. "Are you going to sell it?" "No," he said. "Does he know that?" "He does now," Elias said. He turned around and looked at her. "Third time he's asked." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The payments to Ironwood Land and Development. Those are his company." Elias looked at her steadily. "Where'd you find that?" "Your ledgers," she said. "I was going to ask you about them." "What are the payments for?" Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully name, not guilt, not quite. "Something older and more complicated. An arrangement my father made before he died," he said. Crow claimed he held an easement on the eastern property line. "My father, I think he paid it because it was easier than fighting it. I don't know if the easement is legitimate or not. I never found the original paperwork for it." Maribel thought about that carefully. "What's on the eastern property line?" she asked. Elias looked at her for a moment in a way that suggested the question had hit something. "A creek," he said, "year-round." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Water rights," she said. "Year-round creek in a valley that goes dry most summers," he said. "Yes." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the piece of paper she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, the one with Ironwood L&D written on it, and set it on the table between them. "I think we need to look at the original land records," she said. Elias sat down. "Because a man who wants this property badly enough to ask 3 times and collect payments on a questionable easement," she said, "might also be the kind of man who found a way to make the official records match what he wanted them to say." The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, she could see the dust from Crow's carriage still settling on the track east of the property line. Elias looked at the piece of paper. Then he looked at her. "You got all that," he said slowly, "from the ledgers." "I got all that from the pattern," she said. The ledgers just confirmed what the pattern suggested. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up, and she thought he was going to go back to work. But instead, he went to the far corner of the kitchen and pulled open a drawer she'd organized, but not read through private correspondence. She'd assumed, and left it alone. He took out a folded piece of paper and brought it back to the table and laid it beside her piece of paper. It was a letter 3 years old from a land surveyor. The surveyor had been hired to walk the eastern boundary of the Blackwood property. His letter described a discrepancy between what the county records showed and what he found on the ground. He had recommended that Elias consult with an attorney. "Did you?" she asked. "Consult an attorney?" "I went to the county records office," Elias said. "Man there, Finch, his name was." She looked up. "Short man, hair oil," she said. Elias stared at her. "You know him?" "He was the clerk at the county recorder's office in Harrisburg, Virginia," she said. "He processed the transfer of my father's business. My uncle paid him." The silence in the kitchen was different now. "He's here," Elias said. "He was there," she said carefully. "When I left Virginia, he was working for the county recorder in Harrisburg. But if his name is appearing here in Red Willow in connection with county records. She stopped. The thing she was thinking was large and not fully formed yet, and she had learned, over years of accounting work, not to say the large thing out loud until she could make the numbers hold it up. But Elias was already there with her. She could see it in his face. He moved here, Elias said, after your uncle paid him. After someone paid him, she said carefully. I don't know yet who connects to whom. But I think, she paused. She picked up her piece of paper and his letter and held them side by side. I think the records need to go back further than either of us has looked. She set the papers down, and I think, she said, that I need to see the original land grant. She didn't sleep well that night. That wasn't unusual. She hadn't slept well since Virginia, but this was a different kind of wakefulness. Not the anxious, helpless kind where you lie still and wait for morning because there's nothing else you can do. This was the kind where your mind is running a problem and won't stop until it finds a hold on something solid. She lay in the narrow room off the kitchen and listened to the ranch settle into nighttime sounds and turned the thing over and over. A land surveyor had found a discrepancy 3 years ago. Elias had gone to the county records office and spoken to someone. The someone might have been a man named Finch, the same Finch, who had processed the fraudulent business transfer in Harrisburg, Virginia, the same Finch who had taken her uncle's money and stamped the paperwork that stripped her of everything her father had built. The eastern boundary of this ranch had been moved away from a year-round creek in a valley that went dry most summers. And a man named Silas Crow had been collecting quarterly payments on an easement that Elias's father had paid because it was easier than fighting. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. But they didn't always tell you the whole story on the first reading. You had to come at them from more than one angle. She got up before 4 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a clean piece of paper and wrote down everything she knew in a single column. And then she wrote down everything she didn't know in a second column. And then she looked at the second column for a long time. The original land grant was the thing she needed most. Without it, everything else was circumstantial, suggestive, maybe compelling to her own eyes, but not the kind of thing that held up when someone with money and lawyers pushed back, folded the paper, and put it in her pocket. Outside the kitchen window, the dark was just beginning to soften at the edges. She had work to start. Elias came into the kitchen at 5:30, as he always did, and she had his coffee on the table, and the bacon started, and she watched him sit down and pick up the cup in that deliberate, unhurried way he had of moving through mornings. And she said, I want to go to the county records office today. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Today. I know you have the eastern fence to check, and the hay delivery coming this afternoon, she said. I'm not asking you to take me. I can drive the wagon if you'll let me use it. I'll be back before the delivery. He was quiet for a moment. What are you looking for exactly? The original deed to this property, she said. And if it's there, the original survey documents. And if there's anything filed under Ironwood Land and Development, I want to see that too. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She'd noticed he did that when he was thinking, not fidgeting. Exactly. Just something to keep his hands occupied while his mind worked. County Records Office is run by a man named Albrecht now, he said. Finch left about a year ago. Moved on somewhere. Nobody said where. Does Albrecht know you? We've met. Does he know you're aware of the boundary discrepancy? Elias looked at her. No, when I went before, I only asked general questions. I didn't have a specific thing I was looking for. I just knew something felt wrong. All right, she said. Then I'll go as a new employee doing routine paperwork organization. A housekeeper who needs to understand the property description for household records. People don't look twice at women doing administrative tasks. He set his cup down. Something in his expression shifted, not doubt, but something careful. Maribel. It was the first time he'd used her name without it being required by the sentence. She noticed and kept her face neutral. I understand what you're doing, he said. I want to be clear that I'm not going to pretend I don't. You're not just organizing records. No, she said. I'm not. And if Crow has people in that office, then I'll be very polite and find out nothing useful. And come back and we'll figure out another approach, she said. I've been invisible in record offices before. I know how to do it. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Wagons in the second bay. The gray mare is easier to handle than she looks. Don't let Hank tell you otherwise. He's got a grudge against her from an incident I'm not going into. She almost smiled. Thank you. "Be back by 2, he said, and picked up his coffee again. The drive into Red Willow took 40 minutes on the unpaved road, long enough for the morning to fully establish itself and the overcast to burn off into a thin, pale blue sky. She rehearsed what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. And then she made herself stop rehearsing because, in her experience, overprepared questions came out sounding exactly like overprepared questions. The county records office occupied a low wooden building behind the courthouse. The man at the front desk when she walked in was not Albrecht, it was a younger man, hardly more than a boy really, with ink-stained fingers and a distracted expression, sorting through a stack of papers with a particular energy of someone who had been given a task too large for the time allotted. "Good morning," she said. "I'm here on behalf of the Blackwood Ranch east of town. I'm the new household manager, and I need to look at the property description on file for the title. For our household records." The boy looked up, looked at her, looked back at his papers. "Albrecht's not in until 10, he said. "I don't need to speak with Mr. Albrecht," she said pleasantly. "I just need to look at the public property records." "That's a public record, isn't it?" It was. He knew it was. He set down his papers with the air of someone interrupted mid-task and led her to the back room, where the record books were kept, showed her the index shelf, and left her to it. She had exactly what she needed, an empty room and a wall of records, and no one watching her. She started with the index for property records under Blackwood. The original entry was there, Chester Blackwood, Elias's father, filing a claim in 1871. She found the corresponding record book and opened it to the right page and read the property description carefully, noting the boundary markers and the survey measurements in the margins of her memory. Then she went to the amended records. There were 2 of them. The first was filed in 1874, 3 years after the original claim. It cited a surveying correction. The second was filed in 1876 and cited the First Amendment as its basis. She read both of them twice, slowly. The 1874 amendment moved the eastern boundary approximately 40 yards west of where the original deed had placed it. The 1876 amendment confirmed the new boundary. Both amendments bore the signature of the county surveyor and a notary, and both bore a secondary approval signature from the county recorder's office. The secondary approval signature on both was the same. It was not Albrecht's name. It was a name she had to read 3 times before she was sure she was reading it right. Finch. She stood very still in the back room of the county records office, with the record book open in her hands, and let the full weight of that settle. He had been here. He had signed off on both amendments. He had, or someone had, using his authority, moved this boundary 40 yards west and placed Elias's property short of the creek. She looked at the dates again. 1874, 1876. Elias's father had filed the original claim in 1871. He died, she calculated from what Elias had told her, in 1879, which meant Chester Blackwood had been paying an easement to Crow for what was legally his own creek for at least 3 years before his death, possibly more. She looked at the index again. She checked for other amended property records in the same period. She found 4 more. 4 other properties along the same Eastern Valley corridor, all with boundary amendments filed in the 1874 to 1878 range, all bearing Finch's secondary approval signature. 3 of those properties she recognized from things she'd heard in town. 1 had been sold to a new owner 2 years ago. 1 had been abandoned. 1 she didn't know. She committed everything to memory dates, file numbers, the sequence of amendments, the properties involved, because she did not have paper with her, and she was not going to ask the ink-stained boy out front for any, and she was not going to do anything that might attract attention to what she had found. She closed the record books and put them back in their exact positions and walked out of the back room and thanked the boy at the front desk and left. She sat in the wagon outside for 3 full minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when she needed them to be. But her chest was doing something complicated, because the thing she had just confirmed was not small. It was not a confused old easement or a surveying error or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was a pattern, repeated across multiple properties, executed by the same hand, serving the same interest. She picked up the reins and turned the gray mare back toward the ranch road. She had a hay delivery to be back for by 2 o'clock, and after that, she had a great deal to tell Elias Blackwood. She told him that evening after supper in the office. She laid it out in the same order she'd found it the original deed, the 2 amendments, the dates, the signature, the 4 other properties. She was precise and she did not editorialize. She gave him the information and let him sit with it. He sat with it for a while. The lamp on the desk between them was the only light in the room, and it threw his face into strong relief. And she could watch the thing moving behind his eyes without being able to name it exactly. Not surprise, she didn't think it was fully surprise. Something more like a man who has suspected for years that the ground under his feet isn't solid, finally hearing someone confirm it. 4 other properties, he said. 4 that I found in the same period. There may be more. I only had time to go back to 1,873. The amendments I found were all 1,874 to 1,878, and Finch signed every one. His signature appears on every one, she said carefully. I don't know if that means he acted alone, or if he was operating under direction, but his name is on the approvals. Elias leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He left a year ago. Finch just stopped coming to work one day. Albrecht said he moved on, but nobody knew where. He paused. If Crow knew we were looking, he couldn't have known, she said. I went in as a household manager doing administrative work. The boy at the desk didn't even know what I was looking for. Crow has eyes in this town, Elias said. He said it without drama as a simple statement of fact. He's been collecting information on every property owner in this valley for years. I'm not being dramatic. He knows what cattle I sold last spring and what price I got. She was quiet for a moment, taking that in. All right, she said. Then we move carefully. The next thing I need to see is the original land grant, the territorial document, not the county record. The county records have been altered. The original grant is the document that shows what this property was supposed to be. That would be in Helena, Elias said. The territorial land office. Yes. He looked at her. That's a 2-day trip. I know. Another silence. Outside, she could hear one of the horses shifting in the barn. Maribel, he said. He said it the same way he had that morning, not required by the sentence. Something he'd chosen. Why are you doing this? She looked at him steadily. Because it's the right thing to do. That's not the whole answer, he said. Not unkindly, just accurate. She was quiet for a moment. She had not told many people what had happened in Virginia. Not the full version. She had given Elias the short version the first day, and it had been enough to get her through the door, and she'd left it at that. But the way he was looking at her, now patient, not pushing, the lamp between them and the evening quiet around them, she found herself giving him something closer to the real answer. Because I have spent the last month finding out what it looks like when records get changed to benefit people with money, she said. And I have spent my whole life knowing exactly what I'm worth, even when the records say otherwise. Your father built this ranch. His name is on the original deed. And someone moved his boundary without asking him, and then collected money from him for land that was his. She paused. I know what that feels like. From a different angle, but I know the shape of it. Elias was quiet for a long time. I'll make arrangements for Helena, he said finally. You don't have to come, she said. I can. I'm coming, he said. It wasn't a negotiation. He stood up and looked down at the papers between them on the desk and then at her. You found all this in one morning. I knew what to look for, she said. No, he said. You knew how to look. That's different. He went to bed. She stayed in the office for another hour, making notes from memory about what she'd seen, building the record on paper so she wouldn't have to trust her mind alone with something this important. She was still writing when Hank knocked on the open door and leaned in. He looked at the papers spread on the desk, then at her. You found something, he said. It wasn't a question. Sit down, Hank, she said. He sat. She showed him the notes. He was not a fast reader, but he was a careful one, and he went through what she'd written without interrupting. When he was done, he sat back and was quiet for a moment in the way of a man resorting things he thought he'd already had sorted. I knew something was wrong with that easement, he said. Chester Elias's father told him twice. He said he'd looked into it and there wasn't anything he could do. He probably did look into it, she said, at the county records office, where the records had already been changed. Hank's jaw tightened. How long has Crow been running this? Since at least 1874 by what I can see. Possibly longer. That's 10 years, Hank said. He said it slowly, like a man measuring the weight of something. Yes, she said. He looked at the papers again, then at her. What are you going to do about it? Find the original land grant in Helena, she said, and then find a lawyer who hasn't already been bought. Hank made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That last part might be the harder of the two. I know, she said, but it's not impossible. He nodded slowly. He sat there for another moment, and she could see him deciding something, and then he said, "You want me to go with you to Helena?" She looked at him. The offer was genuine, she could hear it. Not charity, not pity. Hank Mercer was a man who had worked this ranch for 6 years and taken Chester Blackwood's word that the easement was fixed and lived with the nagging knowledge that it wasn't, and he had just found out the shape of what he'd suspected, and he was asking to help. "I think it might be better to keep this between as few people as possible for now," she said carefully. "Not because I don't trust you. Because Crow has eyes in this town," he said. "Yes." He nodded again. "All right, I'll keep my mouth shut and watch things here while you're gone." He pushed back from the desk and stood. "For what it's worth," he said, pausing at the door, "I had you wrong when you got here. Thought you were. I don't know what I thought. Somebody passing through." "I might have been," she said. "But you're not," he said. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He went back to the bunkhouse, and she turned back to her notes. And outside the window, the Montana sky was so thick with stars it looked almost threatening. The trip to Helena took 2 days each way, which meant 4 days away from the ranch. She packed what she needed: her notes, her money, a change of clothes, and Elias drove the wagon to the stage depot in Red Willow before dawn on a Thursday. They didn't speak much on the drive-in. She had noticed that Elias was not a man who used words to fill silence, which she found more comfortable than she'd expected. Cole and Watts were managing the ranch in their absence. Hank was overseeing. Helena was bigger than she'd been prepared for: a proper territorial capital with paved streets in the center, and a government building that took up most of a block. The land office was on the second floor of a stone building near the courthouse, and the clerk there was a tired-looking woman of about 50, who seemed genuinely surprised to have visitors before 9 in the morning. "We're looking for an original territorial land grant," Elias said. He'd let Maribel do most of the talking to this point, but something about standing in the actual territorial capital seemed to straighten him up. Chester Blackwood filed 1,871. Property in the Red Willow Valley. The clerk looked at him. "You related to Chester Blackwood?" "His son," Elias said. Something changed slightly in the woman's expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "I remember that filing," she said. "Your father came in himself, brought his surveyor's documents, paid the full fee in cash." She was already moving toward the back. "Give me a few minutes." It took 11 minutes. Maribel counted. The clerk came back with a large flat envelope and laid it on the counter between them. Inside was a folded document, water-stained at the edges but fully intact, bearing the territorial seal and the signatures of the surveyor, the land office clerk, and the territorial governor's deputy. It was dated June 12, 1871. The property description was detailed and precise. It included measurements in chains and rods, named 4 fixed boundary markers, and described the eastern boundary as running to, and here Maribel read the words twice, "to make certain the near bank of Clear Creek, including full water rights and riparian access." The near bank of Clear Creek, not 40 yards west of it, not a surveyed correction stopping short of it. The near bank. She read it again. Then she looked at Elias, and he was reading it too, and she watched the thing move through his face, a complicated sequence of emotions that she recognized because she had felt versions of it herself. The confirmation that you were right, mixed with the understanding of what it had cost to be right, and ignored for this long. "They moved it 40 yards, he said quietly. "In the 1874 amendment," she said. "Your father filed in 1871 with full creek rights. 3 years later, someone in the county records office amended the boundary and placed it short of the creek. And my father never knew," Elias said. "He may have known something was wrong," she said. "The surveyor you hired 3 years ago found the discrepancy. Your father may have sensed it before that. But if he went to the county records office to check, he'd have found the amended record," Elias said, "and believed it." "Yes," he was quiet. He folded the document carefully and held it. "Can we get a certified copy of this?" Maribel asked the clerk. The clerk, who had been politely looking elsewhere during their exchange, looked back. "I can have one made by this afternoon," she said. "Come back at 3. They found a dining room 2 streets over and ate lunch and sat across from each other in the relative privacy of a corner table, and Maribel spread her notes on the tabletop between the plates. "The original grant proves the legal boundary," she said. "But to show that the county records were deliberately altered, we need someone who can authenticate that the amendment was fraudulent. That means finding whoever Finch was working for or with, or finding enough of a pattern that the alteration becomes undeniable." "You said there were 4 other properties," Elias said. "4 others I found in the time I had. There may be more. If I could get back into those records with enough time." "Not you alone," Elias said. He said it firmly enough that she looked up from her notes. "If Crow finds out someone is going through those records systematically, you're the most obvious target. You're new in town. You don't have family here. He stopped. "I'm alone," she said. "You can say it." "I was going to say you don't have a local history that would protect you," he said carefully. "In a town where Crow has influence, being an outsider with no connections is a vulnerability." She thought about that. He wasn't wrong. She hated that he wasn't wrong. "We need a lawyer," she said. "Thomas Alden." The clerk had mentioned the name when they'd asked if she knew of any land attorneys in Helena. "Old man," she'd said. "Retired mostly, but he knew territorial land law better than anyone alive." They found his office on a narrow street behind the territorial court building. It was a one-room office on the ground floor of an old frame building, and the man behind the desk when they knocked and entered was somewhere in his late 70s, with white hair going thin at the crown and the kind of eyes that had seen enough that very little surprised them anymore. Elias explained the situation. Maribel laid out her notes. Thomas Alden read everything without speaking. He asked 2 questions: the date of the original filing and the name of the surveyor on the 1874 amendment, and when she answered both, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked at her. "You organized this," he said. It was not a question directed at Elias. "Yes," she said. "You have the original grant here?" "Certified copy, ready at 3. He looked at her for a long moment with those tired, seen-everything eyes, and she held his gaze and did not look away or explain herself. "Silas Crow," he said finally. "I've been waiting for someone to bring me something solid on Silas Crow for approximately 4 years. He leaned forward. "Tell me what else you found in those records." She told him. All of it. The sequence of amendments, the 4 other properties, the dates, the pattern of Finch's signatures, the quarterly payments to Ironwood Land and Development. He asked sharp, precise questions, and she answered each one, and when she was done, he sat forward over his desk with his hands folded and looked at the notes she'd laid out and said, "This is circumstantial." "I know," she said. "What you have is suggestive of a systematic fraud. To prove it, you need either the original surveys for the other properties showing what the boundaries were before amendment, or testimony from someone involved in the alterations." "Finch," Elias said. "If you can find him, yes. But Crow will have made sure Finch is not easily findable." Alden paused. "However," he picked up one of her notes. "You said the payments from the Blackwood Ranch to Ironwood Land and Development go back 4 years. That's what the ledgers show. And these payments were described as easement fees." "Yes, for an easement that doesn't exist in the original grant." "The original grant has no easement," she confirmed. "It has a boundary, which was later moved." Alden set the paper down. "Then the easement payments themselves are the fraud," he said. "Crow collected money from Chester Blackwood for an easement that was created by falsifying records. That's not a civil dispute. That's theft." The dining room noise outside seemed very far away suddenly. "Can you file on that basis?" Maribel asked. "I can file on that basis," Alden said. "It won't be fast. Crow will fight it. He has money and he has lawyers who are better paid than I am, and he has relationships in this territory. That I'll be honest with you. Young women are real and relevant and will make this difficult." He looked at Elias. "You understand what you're getting into?" "Yes," Elias said. "He will come after you. Both of you." Alden's eyes moved back to Maribel. "He'll use whatever he has. Do you have anything in your history he might use against you?" She met his gaze. "Yes," she said, "I do." Alden waited. "My uncle accused me of falsifying my father's business record," she said. "The accusation is false, but it was made formally, and it followed me here." Alden nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "Crow will find it," he said, "and he'll use it." "I know," she said. I've been thinking about that. And? And I think if he uses it, she said, it might actually be useful to us. Because the records that would prove my uncle lied, they're connected to payments that match the descriptions in Elias's ranch ledger. My uncle was working with Crow. If he tries to discredit me by dragging out my uncle's accusation, he'll also drag out the records that connect the two of them. Alden looked at her. Then he laughed. It was a dry, brief laugh, the kind that comes from genuine surprise and who doesn't get surprised easily. All right, he said. You'd better get your certified copy from the land office. And then you'd better go back to Red Willow and find every scrap of financial documentation you can get your hands on, both from the ranch and from your personal history. Because I have a feeling we are going to need all of it. She picked up her notes from his desk. How long do we have? She asked. Crow will move to formalize the title challenge within the next 30 days if he's been watching your investigation, Alden said. Which I would assume he has been. 30 days, she said. Possibly less, he said. I'll begin drafting the filing today. But Miss Hartwell, he stopped her at the door. Be careful going back. If Crow has people in Red Willow who reported you going to the records office, he already knows more than you'd like. She looked at him. I know, she said. But I'm not running. Alden looked at her for a long moment with those old, careful eyes. No, he said. I didn't think you were. The ride back was quiet in the way that significant silences are quiet, full of weight and thought rather than emptiness. The certified copy of the original land grant was in her satchel, wrapped in oilcloth. The evening light came low and orange across the valley below the stage road and lit everything sideways, and Montana did that thing it sometimes did, where it looked almost unbearably beautiful in a way that made you forget, for just a moment, the difficulty of living in it. You could have told Alden you didn't have anything in your history he could use, Elias said. He'd been quiet for most of the day. This came out of the quiet without preamble, the way things did when he'd been holding them long enough. Yes, she said. Why didn't you? Because it's not true, she said. And because Alden needs to know the real shape of the situation if he's going to help us. I've learned that giving people partial information to protect yourself tends to collapse at the worst possible moment. Elias was quiet again. Then your uncle accused you of falsifying records. And you said the records that would prove he lied are connected to Crow. Yes, you knew that before today. I suspected it, she said carefully. What I found at the land office confirmed it. He looked at the road ahead. So when you came to my ranch, I came to your ranch because I needed work, she said. I didn't know about Crow. I didn't know about the boundary amendment. I didn't know about Finch. I knew I needed work, and you were the only door in Red Willow that opened. But you found all of this in 3 weeks. I found it because I was looking, she said. Because your ledgers showed payments that didn't make sense. And because I know what falsified financial records look like. She could feel him looking at her from the side, and she kept her eyes on the road. I'm not trying to say your situation and mine are the same, she said. They're not the same. You have land and a ranch and men who've worked for you for years. I arrived with $9 and a bruised face. But we have the same problem, and sometimes that's enough to work from. The stage rolled on into the evening, and Red Willow appeared below them eventually as a collection of lights in the gathering dark, and somewhere in the valley beyond it, she knew, a man named Silas Crow was already being told things she would have preferred he didn't know yet. She held the satchel a little tighter against her side. 30 days. Possibly less. She was going to need every one of them. They got back to Red Willow on a Saturday evening, and by Sunday morning, Maribel knew they'd been followed. Not followed in the dramatic sense, no rider shadowing them on the road, no obvious surveillance. Followed in the quieter, more effective way that money accomplishes. She noticed it when she went to the general store for supplies Monday morning, and the owner, a man named Delbert, who had been carefully neutral toward her since she'd arrived, was suddenly unavailable. His wife managed the counter, and was polite in the clipped, deliberate way of a woman who had been told to be polite, but not friendly. Then Maribel stopped at the post office, and the postmaster, handing over a piece of correspondence Elias had been expecting, looked at her with an expression she recognized the look of a man who had recently received information about someone, and was now reprocessing everything he'd previously assumed. Small things. The kind of things you only noticed if you'd spent years learning to read the temperature of a room before you walked fully into it. She went back to the ranch and told Elias. How long do you think we have before Crow makes a formal move? He asked. Alden said 30 days. I think it's less. The way Delbert's wife looked at me, someone has been talking. Either Crow knows we went to Helena, or he knows we went to the records office, or both. Elias was quiet for a moment. He can't know what we found. He doesn't need to know what we found, she said. He just needs to know we're looking. That's enough for him to accelerate whatever he's planning. She went to the office that afternoon and pulled out every piece of financial documentation she had gathered. Since arriving at the ranch, the organized ledgers, her own notes, the copies she'd made from memory after the records office visit, and the oilcloth-wrapped certified copy of the original land grant. She laid it all on the desk and looked at it and thought about what was missing. What was missing was the connection between Crow and her uncle. She had suspected it in Helena, and Alden had taken it seriously, but suspicion wasn't documentation. She needed to find the thread that ran from Gerald Hartwell's falsified business records in Harrisburg, Virginia, to Silas Crow's operation in Montana, and she needed it in a form that a territorial court would take seriously. The problem was that her uncle's records were in Virginia, and she was in Montana, and she had approximately, she counted the money in the box in her room, $6.20 of her own money remaining, plus her wages, which Elias paid on the first of the month, and which were due in 11 days. She was sitting with that problem when Hank knocked on the office door. Man in the yard, he said. Didn't come up the road. Came from the east fence line. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. The man in the yard was not Crow. He was younger 30s, well-dressed in a way that read as deliberate rather than natural, the kind of clothes a man wore when he wanted to signal that he represented someone important. He had a pleasant face and the eyes of someone doing a job. Elias was standing on the porch when she came out. The man had stopped at the base of the porch steps. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said, "my name is Garrett. I represent certain business interests in this valley. I'm here to deliver a message, not to negotiate." "Say it then," Elias said. Garrett looked at Maribel briefly. Something registered in his face, not recognition, but the particular attention of a man who has been given a description and is now confirming it against the reality in front of him. "My employer is aware that you've been conducting inquiries into property records," Garrett said, "both locally and in Helena. He wanted you to know that he considers those inquiries an escalation of what had previously been a manageable disagreement, and that escalation has consequences." "For who?" Elias said. "For the ranch," Garrett said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "This is a formal notice of title dispute, filed this morning with the county clerk. My employer is challenging the validity of the current Blackwood title on the basis that the property boundaries were never properly established under territorial law." Elias took the envelope. He didn't open it. "Your employer can challenge whatever he likes," he said. "The courts are public." Garrett smiled in the practiced way of a man who smiles as a tool. "They are," he said. "Which means the proceedings will also be public, including any testimony about the character and reliability of parties involved." His eyes moved to Maribel again, and this time they stayed there. "Miss Hartwell." She held his gaze. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "We haven't," he said. "But my employer has made it his business to know something about everyone connected to this property dispute. He wanted me to tell you specifically, and I'm quoting him, that a woman with your particular history in Virginia should think very carefully about how much attention she wants to attract." Maribel was aware of Hank behind her, the stillness of him sharpening. "Tell your employer," she said, keeping her voice level, "that I've been thinking about exactly that since I arrived in Montana, and I've come to the conclusion that the attention is worth it." Garrett looked at her for a moment with those flat, professional eyes. Then he put his hat back on and walked back across the yard in the direction he'd come from, which was not the road. They watched him go. "He came from the east fence," Hank said behind her. "I know," she said. "He wanted us to know he can come and go from that direction without using the road. That's Crow's surveyed boundary," Elias said quietly. "The false one. He came from the creek." She understood what he was saying. Crow was demonstrating, without a word about it, that he already behaved as though the disputed land belonged to him. She went inside and sat down at the desk and opened her notes and stared at them. He knew about Virginia. She had told Alden, and she'd been right to tell him, but she hadn't fully reckoned with how quickly Crow would find it and how effectively he would deploy it. The accusation her uncle had made was formal, on record, and attached to her name. It would follow her into a courtroom if Crow chose to bring it, and there was nothing she could do to stop him from bringing it, unless she could prove it was false. And to prove it was false, she needed the original financial records from her father's business. The ones Gerald had kept. The ones she'd been forced to leave behind when she walked out of the office in Harrisburg with a bruised face and nothing in her hands. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and wrote a letter. She wrote it to Darby, the clerk who had been sitting 8 feet away when Gerald struck her, and had looked at the floor and chosen not to see it. She had not spoken to Darby since that morning, had not thought about him much, had filed him away in a category of people who were not strong enough to do the right thing under pressure. But she thought about him now. Darby had kept Gerald's books after she left. He would know where the records were. He would also know if he had any conscience at all, and she believed he might underneath the fear that what Gerald had done was wrong. She wrote him a careful letter. She did not accuse Gerald in the letter. She did not ask Darby to do anything illegal or even particularly risky. She asked him a single specific question: were the business records prior to Chester Hartwell's death still kept in the office? And if so, in which filing cabinet? She sealed the letter and put it in her pocket and did not tell Elias she'd written it. Not because she was hiding it from him, but because she wasn't sure yet whether it would come to anything, and she had learned not to build arguments on correspondence that might never be answered. She mailed it the next day when she went into town for supplies. Then she came back and worked. The pattern she had identified in the county records the sequential amendments, the properties along the Eastern Valley corridor, the Finch signatures she now systematized in full. She drew a map from memory, marking each property she'd identified against the valley geography she'd pieced together from conversations with Hank and her own observations. 6 properties in total, including the Blackwood Ranch. The corridor of amended boundaries created a continuous strip of land between the original legal boundary and Crow's claimed boundary, and running along that strip, she was almost certain of it, was Clear Creek. She sat back and looked at the map. If Crow had moved the boundary on 6 properties along the creek corridor, he had effectively claimed the water rights to the entire upper valley without ever officially purchasing them. Every rancher along that corridor who had accepted the amended boundary, whether from ignorance or from being unable to fight, had ceded their creek access to Crow, a year-round creek in a valley that went dry every summer. With that creek, you could support cattle through drought years, when everyone else was selling stock at a loss. You could irrigate. You could hold out when your neighbors couldn't. In a territory where water meant the difference between a viable operation and an abandoned one, controlling that creek was worth more than all the land prices combined. She showed Elias the map that evening. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "There's a family named Pruett," he said finally. "Margaret Pruett. She's a widow, runs what's left of her husband's property about 6 miles south of here." Maribel remembered the name. "I worked for a Mrs. Pruett when I first arrived," she said. 3 days of laundry. "That's her," Elias said. "Her husband Carl died 2 years ago. Before he died, he told me he'd been paying an easement fee to someone he thought it was a county water assessment. He didn't know it was going to Crow." He paused. "I should have pushed harder on that. I knew something was wrong." "You were managing your own ranch and your own grief," she said. He looked at her. "That's not an excuse, I know," she said. "But it's a reason." He was quiet for a moment. "If Margaret Pruett has the same amendment on her property records." "She almost certainly does," Maribel said. "Her property is directly on the corridor. And if she's been paying an easement fee she thought was a county assessment, that's another financial record connecting Crow to the same scheme." "She won't want to get involved," Elias said. "She's managing alone. She has 2 sons still at home, neither of them older than 15. She can't afford a legal fight." "She may not have to fight," Maribel said. "If we can build enough evidence from existing records, the other property owners become witnesses, not litigants. Their records corroborate the pattern. They don't necessarily have to take on Crow directly." Elias thought about that. "You want to talk to her?" "I think I should," she said. "You coming with me might make it feel larger than she's ready for. I know her a little. I can go as a neighbor." "You're not exactly a neighbor," he said. "Close enough," she said. "I worked 3 days of laundry for her." He almost smiled at that. It was the nearest thing to a real smile she'd seen from him, and it changed his face enough that she looked away before it could do anything complicated to her train of thought. She drove to the Pruett property on Wednesday morning. It was a smaller operation than the Blackwood Ranch, a modest house, a barn that needed work, a kitchen garden that had been tended carefully. Margaret Pruitt answered the door herself. She was a slight woman, maybe 50, with hands that showed the kind of work she did and eyes that showed the kind of year she'd had. She recognized Maribel. "Miss Hartwell," she said. "I didn't expect to see you." "I apologize for coming without notice," Maribel said. "I have something I need to show you. It concerns your property." Margaret Pruitt's expression was the particular expression of a woman who had been expecting bad news long enough that its arrival was almost a relief. She stepped back from the door. "Come in, then," she said. Maribel sat at Margaret Pruitt's kitchen table and laid out what she'd found careful, methodical, in the same order she'd presented it to Alden. She did not overdramatize. She explained what the original land grants would have specified, what the amendments had changed, and what it meant in practical terms for any property along the creek corridor. Margaret listened without interrupting. She got up once to pour coffee for both of them, and sat back down and kept listening. When Maribel was done, Margaret sat for a long moment looking at the map Maribel had drawn. "Carl paid that fee for 7 years," she said. "I know. He thought it was a county assessment, a water use fee." She pressed her lips together. "He asked me once if it seemed right to me, and I told him I didn't know. I wasn't the one who managed accounts. I told him to trust the county paperwork." A pause. "He trusted the county paperwork. He had no reason not to," Maribel said. "He's dead now," Margaret said very quietly. "And Crow's man came by last spring and told me I was behind on the easement payment. Said if I didn't pay up, there'd be a formal dispute on my water access." She looked at Maribel. "I paid it. I didn't know what else to do. Do you still have the records? The payment receipts?" "Carl kept everything," Margaret said. "In a tin box in the bedroom. He kept everything because he didn't trust banks, and he didn't trust loose papers. He said the only thing you could trust was a written record in a locked box." She said it with a kind of fond bitterness. He was right. Just didn't know how far the dishonesty reached. She brought out the tin box. Inside were 7 years of receipts, quarterly payments, all described as easement assessment, Eastern Water Corridor, all bearing the Ironwood land and development name, and a signature Maribel didn't recognize, but could match against other documents. She spread them on the table, between them. "I need to take copies of these," she said. "I'll copy them by hand right now if you have paper. I won't take the originals unless you agree to it. Take whatever you need," Margaret said. She looked at the receipts with the expression of someone looking at evidence of a long, slow theft. "What happens now?" "We have a lawyer in Helena," Maribel said. "Thomas Alden. He's filing a challenge to the title dispute Crow has raised against the Blackwood Ranch. If we can document the same pattern across multiple properties, it stops being a boundary dispute between Elias Blackwood and Silas Crow. It becomes something the territorial court has to treat as a systematic fraud." "And Crow?" Margaret said. "What happens to him?" "I don't know yet," Maribel said honestly. "But I know that right now he thinks he can manage this by threatening Elias and discrediting me. He doesn't know how much we've already documented." Margaret looked at her steadily. "He threatened you?" "He sent a message," she said, "about my history in Virginia. He's going to try to use it against me in court." "What history?" Maribel paused. She had not intended to get into this. But Margaret Pruitt was looking at her with those tired, direct eyes, and she had the sense that partial truths would not serve either of them well at this point. "My uncle accused me of falsifying my father's financial records after my father died," she said. "The accusation was false, but it's on record. Crow found it." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Did you do it?" "No," Maribel said. "Then prove it," Margaret said, as simply as that. Maribel almost laughed. "I'm working on it." She copied the 7 years of Pruitt receipts by hand. It took nearly 2 hours, and when she was done, Margaret fed her lunch without being asked, setting down a plate of bread and cold meat with the matter-of-fact hospitality of a woman who had learned that feeding people was one of the few things she could control. "There were other families along this corridor," Maribel said, while she ate. "Do you know them? The ones with properties between here and the Blackwood Ranch?" "The Kendalls sold out 2 years ago. Moved to Oregon." Margaret sat across from her. "The Weatherbys are still there. Abel Weatherby's been sick most of the year. His wife Dora manages the operation now. There's the Holloways past the ridge. They haven't paid any easement that I know of, but they also don't have creek access. Their land sits too far west." She paused. "And then there's the Stearns property. Been abandoned for 3 years. Abandoned why?" "Tom Stearns couldn't keep up the payments after the drought, and the easement fee both hit the same year. Sold the livestock, tried to hold on, couldn't. Went back east. She looked at her coffee. People around here thought it was just bad luck. Bad management. Do you think it was? Maribel asked. Margaret looked at the tin box on the table between them. I think Tom Stearns was a decent man who couldn't fight what he couldn't see, she said. Maribel drove back to the Blackwood Ranch in the late afternoon with 2 hours of handwritten copies in her satchel and a map that now had 3 more points marked on it, and she told Elias everything Margaret Pruett had said. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, turning his coffee cup in his hands. The Stearns property, he said, when she was done. Crow bought it. She looked at him. When? 8 months after Tom left. Bank foreclosure. Crow purchased it at roughly a third of market value. He paused. I went to the auction. I couldn't match the price. She wrote that down. Abandoned property. Foreclosed. Purchased by Crow at a fraction of value. 8 months after the owner left following drought and easement pressure. It fit the pattern perfectly, it was in fact, probably the model for the pattern. Drive out a property owner through financial pressure they couldn't identify or fight, then acquire the land cheaply through foreclosure. She was still working on that when the boarding house in Red Willow sent a boy out with a message. She read it twice. It was addressed to her at the Blackwood Ranch, which meant someone in town knew she was there, which was not a surprise. It was not signed. It was printed in careful block letters on plain paper, and it said, "There is a man staying at the Greer Hotel who has been asking about you. He arrived 2 days ago from the east. He is not Crow's man. He says he has information about your uncle's records." She folded the note. "What is it?" Elias said. She handed it to him. He read it and set it on the table and looked at it. "Could be legitimate," he said. "Could be a trap," she said. "Crow knows enough about my history to construct something designed to pull me into a situation. Or someone in Virginia actually has information," Elias said. "Darby, maybe. If he responded to your letter." She looked at him. "You knew about the letter." "Hank saw you mail it," he said. Not accusatory, just factual. She said nothing for a moment. "I wasn't hiding it." "I know," he said. "I didn't ask you about it because it was your decision to make." He picked up the note again. "The question is whether you go. The question is whether I go alone," she said. "You're not going alone," he said. And that again was not a negotiation. They went into Red Willow the next morning. Elias drove. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, with her satchel in her lap and the note in her coat pocket, and tried to calculate every possible version of what they might find. The Greer Hotel was the establishment where the front desk man had looked at her on her first day in Red Willow and dismissed her in under 5 seconds. She walked through the door now, with Elias beside her, and found the same man, Greer himself, behind the desk. He looked at Elias first, then at her, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition that the situation had changed from whenever his last calculation had been made. "We're here to see a guest," Elias said. "He's been asking about Miss Hartwell." "Room 6, Greer said immediately. "Second floor." She noticed he didn't ask which guest, which meant he knew exactly who they meant. She noticed also that he reached under the desk when he said it, and she was fairly sure he was reaching for something to write on, and she was fairly sure he was going to send a message to someone as soon as they were up the stairs. Room 6 was at the end of the hall. She knocked. The man who opened the door was not what she expected. He was young, mid-20s at most, with an ink stain on his right index finger that she recognized immediately, because she had last seen it when he was sitting at his desk 8 feet from the corner of her father's mahogany desk, staring at the floor. "Darby," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was 1 part relief and 2 parts something closer to shame. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "I'm glad they found you. I didn't know if the message would reach you." He looked at Elias briefly. "I came as soon as I got your letter. I couldn't write back. I was afraid of Mr. Hartwell finding the correspondence, so I came." She looked at him for a long moment. He was thinner than she remembered. He looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to put it down, regardless of where he was standing when he did it. "Come in," she said. Darby sat on the edge of the bed, which was the only chair in the small room, besides the one at the writing desk, and Elias stood near the door, and Maribel stood in the middle of the room and looked at Darby and said, "Tell me what you know," he told her. It came out in the careful, precise order of a man who had rehearsed it many times on a long journey. He had stayed at the business after Maribel left. He had kept Gerald Hartwell's books for 18 months. In those 18 months, he had seen things that didn't sit right with him, payments, described in ways that didn't match any vendor he recognized, correspondence with a company in Montana that Gerald kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk, a visit from a well-dressed man who had arrived from the West with a leather satchel and spent 3 hours with Gerald behind a closed door. "What company in Montana?" Maribel said. Darby looked at her. "Ironwood Land and Development," he said. She was very still. "Darby," she said, "the ledgers. The ones before my father died, the ones I kept. Are they still in the office?" "Yes," he said. Gerald couldn't remove them without raising questions. "They're in the filing cabinet behind the main desk. Locked, but I know where the key is kept." He paused. "I brought copies." He reached under the bed and pulled out a flat leather portfolio, the kind used for large documents, and handed it to her. She opened it. Inside were 27 pages of handwritten copies, dated from 1000, 876 to 1000, 880, covering the period of her father's declining health and Gerald's increasing involvement in the business. The copies were precise. Darby had a good hand and a clear mind, and he had copied not only the ledger entries but the marginal notations in Gerald's own handwriting. Maribel read through them with the focused attention of someone looking at familiar territory through a new lens. She found it on page 14. A payment description in Gerald's hand, dated March of 1000, 878, survey coordination fee I, LD per SC arrangement, ILD Ironwood Land and Development. SC, she sat down in the chair at the writing desk. SC, she said aloud. Silas Crow, Elias said from the doorway. Silas Crow, she confirmed. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. My uncle was taking direction from Crow in 1878. Paying fees described the same way as the payments in your ranch ledger. 2 years before my father died. She looked up at Darby. Did you know what these payments were for when you copied them? Not entirely, Darby said. I knew they were irregular. I knew your uncle didn't want anyone looking at them. When your letter came asking about the records, I went and looked at them properly for the first time. And then I understood what I'd been sitting next to for 2 years without seeing. His voice had something in it she didn't have a word for immediately. Regret, yes. But underneath that, the specific exhaustion of a young man who had stayed too long in a situation that cost him pieces of himself. The accusation against me, she said. The falsified books claim. Do these records prove that my father's books were accurate? Your ledgers are complete and consistent, Darby said. Every entry matches the receipts in the files. Every payment out matches a vendor. The business was profitable and properly managed right up to the month your father got sick. He looked at his hands. The irregularities start with Gerald's notations. After he began corresponding with Ironwood, she closed the portfolio. She sat for a moment with both hands flat on it and looked at the wall above the writing desk and breathed. She had spent months carrying the weight of that accusation. Carrying it through Virginia, through the train west, through 3 days of rejected work applications in Red Willow. Through the first weeks at the Blackwood Ranch, when she'd wondered every morning whether the door that had opened would close again. She had told herself she knew it was false. She had told herself her own certainty was enough. She had not been entirely honest with herself about how much it had cost to carry it anyway. Darby, she said finally. Yes, ma'am. Are you willing to testify what you've told me in a territorial court? A long pause. She did not look at him while he thought about it. She gave him the space to arrive at the answer on his own, without pressure, because she needed it to be a real answer, not one pulled out of him by obligation. Yes, he said. I am. She nodded once. All right. She picked up the portfolio and stood. Elias was looking at her from the doorway with that calm, reading expression he had, and she met his eyes for a moment, and something passed between them that neither of them put into words. We need to get you to Helena, she told Darby, to an attorney named Thomas Alden. Can you travel? I came this far, he said. Then pack your bags, she said. We're leaving tomorrow morning. She walked out of room 6 and down the hall and down the stairs and through the hotel lobby past Greer at the front desk, and she was aware, with the particular alertness of someone who has just changed the shape of a situation, that Greer watched her all the way across the lobby and picked up the message he'd been writing before she was through the door. Crow would know about Darby by tonight, which meant whatever Crow was planning to do with the information about Virginia, he would now be calculating against the possibility that she'd just found the answer to it. She reached the wagon in the street and stopped and gripped the side rail and let herself feel the full weight of the last hour what Darby had brought her, what it meant, what it changed, and then she let it settle. The way you let a calculation settle when you know the numbers are finally right. And she straightened up and looked at the street of red willow around her. Crow's messenger had told her she should not attract attention. She had done quite a lot of attracting attention, and she was not done yet. They left for Helena the next morning before the town was properly awake. Maribel had not slept. She'd spent most of the night at the desk in the office, organizing everything they had into a single coherent sequence, not for herself, because she already held the whole structure in her head, but for Alden, who would need to present it to a court in a form that left no gap a lawyer could push a doubt through. She wrote it out in full: the original land grant, the 2 boundary amendments, the Finch signatures, the 6 properties along the creek corridor, the Pruitt receipts, the Blackwood Ranch ledger payments. And now the portfolio Darby had carried across 2 territories in a leather case under a train seat, the connection to Gerald Hartwell, and the notation that named Silas Crow directly. She numbered every document. She wrote a summary page at the front that listed each piece of evidence, what it proved on its own, and what it proved in combination with the others. She had learned from 4 years of accounting work that the most important thing a document could do was sit correctly in a sequence. A single record proved a transaction. A sequence proved a pattern. And a pattern, properly laid out so that even a skeptical reader could follow it without getting lost, proved intent. When she was done, it was nearly 4 in the morning, and the lamp was burning low. She trimmed it and sat back and read through the summary page one more time. It was good. It was the best she could do with what she had. She folded it into the portfolio with Darby's copies and set it with the oilcloth-wrapped land grant and her own organized notes, and went to get 2 hours of sleep before the wagon left. Hank was up when she came through the kitchen. He was at the table with coffee that he'd clearly been drinking for a while, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had also not slept and was not going to mention it. "You're taking Darby to Helena," he said. "Yes, Elias is going." "Yes." He turned his cup in his hands. "Cole and Watts can handle the stock. Ruiz knows the fence line better than anyone." He paused. "If Crow sends anyone while you're gone, don't engage them," she said immediately. "Whatever they say, whatever they claim, don't engage. Get their names if you can, and write down what they say, and the time they said it. Don't give them anything, and don't sign anything." Hank looked at her. "I've been managing situations on this ranch for 6 years." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry, You're afraid we'll lose ground while you're away," he said, not unkindly. "That's fair. But I know this property, and I know what belongs to it. Nobody's taking anything from this ranch while you're in Helena." She looked at him across the kitchen table, this big, careful, deliberate man who had doubted her on the first day and been honest about it afterward, and she felt something that she recognized but didn't name. "Thank you, Hank," she said. "Get some sleep," he said. 2 hours is better than none. She got 90 minutes. The drive to Helena, with 3 people on the wagon bench, was slower and more crowded than the first trip, and Darby spent most of the first half of the journey looking out at the Montana landscape with the expression of a man who had
Not been out of Virginia before and was trying to reconcile the territory with any image he'd previously carried of it.
Elias drove. Maribel sat between them with the satchel on her lap. Nobody talked much for the first hour, which suited all of them. Then Darby said, "How much does this lawyer know already?" "He knows the property case," Maribel said. "The boundary amendments, the creek rights, the ironwood payments. He knows about my uncle's accusation and that I intend to fight it. He doesn't know about you yet. Will he use me as a witness?" "That's his decision," she said. "But I think he'll want to. Your testimony about the Gerald Crow connection is the thing that turns this from a local land dispute into something the territorial court has to take seriously as a wider fraud." Darby was quiet for a moment. "Gerald's going to know it was me." "Yes," she said. "He'll try to destroy my reputation." "He'll try," she said. "But his own records will undercut him. The copies you made show his handwriting, his notations. A court can compare his hand to the originals." "You've thought all of this through," Darby said. "Several times," she said. He looked at the road ahead. "I should have come forward sooner. I should have when he hit you. I should have said something, done something." He stopped. "I know that." She looked at him. He was staring at the road, jaw tight, the ink stain on his finger visible against the pale of his hand. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters now. Does it make up for it?" She thought about that honestly. "No," she said. But it matters anyway. He nodded slowly and said nothing else for a while, and the wagon rolled on into the Montana morning. Alden's office was exactly as she'd left it, cramped, paper-stacked, the old man behind his desk with the careful eyes. He looked at Darby when they came in, and then at Maribel with a question in his expression that she answered before he could ask it. "This is Darby Foss," she said. "He kept my uncle's books after I left Virginia. He has copies of the pre-death ledgers that prove my father's accounts were accurate, and he has copies of Gerald Hartwell's post-death ledgers that show payments to Ironwood Land and Development with a notation connecting them to Silas Crow by initial." She set the portfolio on Alden's desk. He opened it without speaking and began to read. He read for 22 minutes. She counted because she had nothing else to do with her hands. Elias sat in the chair against the wall. Darby stood near the door as though he hadn't decided yet whether he was fully committed to being in the room. Alden read in the focused silence of a man who has done this for 50 years and still treats every document as though it might contain the thing that changes everything. When he was done, he looked up. "How did you organize this?" he asked Maribel. "Summary page at the front," she said. "Each document numbered, what it proves individually and in combination. The sequence is chronological except for the Hartwell records, which I've placed after the Ironwood evidence, so the connection is established before the personal element is introduced." Alden looked at the summary page again. "You put the personal element last deliberately, because if you introduce it first, it looks like a personal grievance that's been grafted onto a property dispute," she said. "If you introduce it after the systematic fraud is established, it becomes evidence of how far the scheme reached." He set the portfolio down and folded his hands on top of it. "I have been practicing territorial law for 31 years, he said. "I've worked with perhaps 4 people who knew instinctively how to construct an evidentiary sequence that would hold up under cross-examination." He looked at her steadily. "You are one of them." She didn't know what to say to that. She said nothing. "The hearing is in 9 days, Alden said. Crow's lawyers filed a motion to expedite, which tells me they believe they have a strong position and want to move before we can build one. They are going to be unpleasantly surprised." He looked at Darby. "Mr. Foss, are you prepared to testify under oath to the authenticity of these copies and to your direct observation of the payments and correspondence?" Darby straightened slightly. "Yes, sir. Have you retained any personal legal representation?" "No, sir." "Get some before the hearing. I can recommend a colleague here in Helena who won't charge you more than you have." He made a note. "Crow's lawyers will go after you hard. They'll question your motivations, your relationship with the Hartwell family, why you waited this long." He looked at Darby without softening it. "You need to be ready for that." "I know," Darby said. "Why did you wait?" Alden asked, directly, no preamble. Darby's jaw worked for a moment. "Because I was afraid. And because I told myself it wasn't my fight. And because by the time I understood what I was looking at, I'd been sitting next to it long enough that coming forward felt like admitting I'd done something wrong by not coming forward sooner." He paused. "And because Miss Hartwell's letter arrived and I read it, and I realized I was running out of time to be the kind of person I wanted to be." Alden looked at him for a long moment. "Say exactly that in the courtroom," he said. "Don't dress it up." They left Helena on Friday with 9 days until the hearing. The return drive was quieter than the trip out, but a different kind of quiet, not the compressedness of people holding their worry, but the particular stillness that settles after a decision has been made and confirmed, and there is nothing to do now but execute. Darby would stay in Helena with Alden's colleague until the hearing. He had enough money for a week if he was careful, and Elias had given him $20 without being asked and told him not to argue about it. Darby had looked at Elias with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating his understanding of what kind of man Elias Blackwood was. She and Elias drove back to the ranch in time for the evening meal, and she cooked supper a real one, not the quick, practical cooking of a working week, but something that took actual time and attention, because she needed her hands to be busy while her mind worked. She made a proper stew with the dried beans she'd been soaking since before they left, and the beef from the cold box and cornbread that came out slightly darker on one side than the other, because the oven ran hot on the right. Hank ate 2 plates without comment. Cole and Watts ate quickly and went back to the bunkhouse. Ruiz, who had the particular gift of knowing when the room required quiet, finished his meal and nodded to her on his way out. Elias stayed at the table after the others left. She was washing up at the basin, her back to the room, when he said, 9 days. 9 days, she agreed. Is it enough? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Alden has what he needs, she said. The question is what Crow does with the next 9 days. He'll come here, Elias said. He's not the kind of man who waits for a courtroom if he thinks he can resolve it before. She turned from the basin and looked at him. You think he'll make another offer? I think he'll make a final offer, Elias said. And if that doesn't work, he'll threaten. And if the threat doesn't work, he stopped. What? He was looking at the table. Before you came. Last spring, one of my fence lines was cut on the eastern boundary. I found 3 of my cattle driven onto what Crow claims is his property. He let me take them back without a dispute, but the message was clear enough. She sat down across from him. He's done this before. Not to the house, he said. But the property, yes. Small things. Enough to say he could do more. She thought about Hank sitting up with coffee at 4 a.m, about the way he'd said nobody's taking anything from this ranch. We need to send Alden a message tomorrow, she said. About the fence cutting. About the cattle. If Crow has been applying physical pressure to the property, that's part of the pattern too. It was a fence, Elias said. I can't prove who cut it. You don't have to prove it beyond doubt, she said. You have to show the court a pattern of behavior that establishes Crow's intent. A formal title dispute plus economic pressure through false easement fees plus physical interference with property together. They say something that none of them says alone. He looked at her. You think like a lawyer. I think like an accountant, she said. It's the same thing, except accountants are less expensive and more honest about what the numbers actually say. He almost laughed. The same ghost of it she'd seen before. She was starting to recognize that it was actually a laugh, that this was what Elias Blackwood's laughter looked like, quiet and contained, more in the eyes than the mouth, gone almost before you could confirm you'd seen it. Get some sleep, he said. Real sleep. Not 90 minutes. You counted. Hank told me, he said. He was worried. She looked at her hands for a moment. They were rough now in a way they hadn't been when she'd arrived. Ranch work did that, even to hands that had spent years managing accounts. She didn't mind it. The roughness felt like something earned. I'll sleep, she said, after I write the message to Alden. He stood up and pushed in his chair and paused at the kitchen door. Maribel, she looked up. What you said in Helena, he said, about coming to the ranch because you needed work, and not knowing about Crow. I believed you then, and I believe you now. I just want to say. He stopped. Started again. What you've done since you got here. The records, the map, Darby, the Pruitt receipts. None of that was part of any arrangement between us. You went after all of it because you thought it was right. She looked at him steadily. It was right, she said. I know, he said. That's what I'm saying. He seemed to run out of words then, which was not unusual for him, and he went to bed, and she sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet before she got up to write the message to Alden. Crow came on the 5th day before the hearing. She heard the carriage before she saw it. The same painted wheels and good spokes she'd seen the first time he'd come to the ranch. She was in the yard bringing water from the pump, and she set the bucket down and waited. He came in different this time. No performance of pleasantry. He got out of the carriage and walked across the yard with the flat efficiency of a man who has stopped managing how he appears. Elias was already on the porch. She stayed in the yard. Crow stopped between them, which she thought was probably deliberate, not quite approaching the porch, not quite in the yard, keeping both of them in his visual field. He was older looking than she remembered, or maybe she was just seeing him more clearly now. I'll make this brief, Crow said. He was looking at Elias. $15,000. Clear title transfer. All disputes withdrawn. You take the money and you and your people leave this property within 60 days. Elias said nothing. That's a fair price, Crow said. It's more than fair given the legal situation. The legal situation, Elias said, is that the court is going to see the original land grant in 4 days. Something shifted in Crow's expression. Not panic. Something more controlled and therefore more frightening, the recalculation of a man who has contingencies. Original grants are historical documents, Crow said. They're subject to subsequent legal amendment. The county records reflect those amendments. The county records were falsified, Elias said. Crow looked at him for a long moment. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented fact, Elias said. We have the amendments. We have the signature on both of them. We have 7 years of your easement payment receipts from 3 different properties along the same creek corridor. We have financial records from Virginia, connecting your operation to a business associate who falsified accounts and then accused an innocent woman of doing it. Crow turned to look at Maribel then. She had been waiting for it. Miss Hartwell, he said. He said her name the way he said everything, with the practiced weight of a man accustomed to having his words mean more than their literal content. You've been busy. Yes, she said. You understand that none of what you've gathered will survive scrutiny in a territorial court. He said it without heat. You're an accountant's daughter from Virginia with a fraud accusation on your record and no standing in this territory. Your lawyer is a retired old man who hasn't tried a case in 4 years. Your witness is a frightened boy who kept his employer's books for 18 months and stayed silent until he was contacted by a woman with a personal interest in the outcome. He tilted his head slightly. I'm not threatening you. I'm describing the reality of what you're walking into. She let him finish. Everything you just described is true, she said. I am an accountant's daughter from Virginia. Thomas Alden is older than either of us. Darby Foss did stay silent too long. She paused. None of that changes what the documents say. And the documents say that your company collected money from 6 property owners along Clear Creek for an easement that you created by paying a county records clerk to alter boundary descriptions in the official record. It says that your operation reaches from Montana to Virginia and includes at least one business associate whose personal actions, including assaulting a woman and falsifying financial accusations against her, were conducted in the service of your interests. Crow looked at her. I've already submitted the financial evidence connecting you to Gerald Hartwell to the territorial court, she said. Not as part of Elias's case, as a separate filing. Alden filed it 2 days ago. That landed. She could see it. The very slight contraction around his eyes that told her she had said something he hadn't expected. You're reaching, he said, but it was a beat slower than everything else he'd said. I'm done reaching, she said. Everything I've just told you is already in the court record. The reason I'm telling you now is so that you understand that there is no version of the next 4 days in which this goes the way you planned it. Crow looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Elias. 20,000, he said. Final. No, Elias said. Crow put his hat on. He looked back at Maribel one more time, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not defeat. Not yet. But the first awareness that defeat was a real possibility. You should have taken the money, he said to Elias. Whatever happens in that courtroom, this valley is going to be a harder place to live after it. It's been a hard place to live for 10 years, Elias said, because of you. Crow walked back to his carriage and got in, and the driver turned the horses, and the painted wheels went back down the ranch track toward the road. Maribel stood in the yard and watched the dust settle. Hank came out of the barn. He'd been in there since the carriage arrived. He looked at the road and then at her. 20,000, he said. Yes. Elias said no. Yes. Hank made the sound that was almost a laugh. Good. He picked up the bucket she'd set down and carried it the rest of the way to the trough for her, which was a very Hank way of saying something without saying it. She had 4 days. She spent them working. Not the ranch work Cole and Watts and Ruiz had that in hand, but the case. She went through everything one more time, checking her numbered sequence against Alden's last letter, looking for anything she'd missed or anything that could be challenged and hadn't been addressed. She found 2 gaps, small ones. Places where the chain of inference was solid, but the documentary support was thinner than she'd like, and she wrote Alden a letter that night, laying them out specifically and asking if he could address them in the way he framed the argument. He wrote back in 2 days with answers to both. On the 3rd night before the hearing, she was sitting in the office when Elias came in and sat in the chair across the desk from her, the same chair she'd sat in that first evening. When she'd laid out for him what she'd found in the records office, and they'd both understood that the thing they were facing was larger than either of them had initially reckoned with. How are you feeling? He asked. She looked up from her papers. The question surprised her slightly, not because it was inappropriate, but because Elias did not, as a rule, ask questions that opened that kind of territory. Nervous, she said honestly. But ready. Those 2 things don't usually go together, he said. They do if you've done the work, and you still understand that the outcome isn't entirely yours to control, she said. I've done everything I can do from this side of the hearing. The rest is Alden and the documents and what the judge decides to see. He nodded slowly. My father would have liked you, he said. She looked at him. He was a man who believed in the work, Elias said. Not luck, not who you knew, not how things looked, what you actually did, what you could actually show. He He was looking at the surface of the desk between them, the same desk she'd organized in her first week at the ranch, the same desk that had held the disordered accumulation of a man managing too much alone. He built this ranch from a single land grant and a herd of 40 cattle. He didn't borrow. He didn't use his neighbors. He just worked until what he had was worth protecting. A pause. Someone stole from him quietly for years, and he never knew. "You know now," she said, "because you found it. Because you kept the record," she said, "and because your father filed the original grant properly and kept it current. The document that proves everything is a document your father made. That's not nothing." He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was not the careful, neutral expression she'd learned to read over weeks of working alongside him, but something older and less managed. "I know what I'm asking you to do in that courtroom," he said. "Standing up in front of Crow's lawyers with your history in the record and letting them come at it. I'm not doing it for you," she said, not unkindly. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and because my name is in that record, and I want it back. And also because you gave me work when nobody else would, and I don't take that lightly." She paused. "But I need you to understand that I'm not going into that courtroom as someone who owes you something. I'm going in as someone who has a stake in the outcome." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's exactly right," he said finally. "Good," she said. The hearing was in 4 days, then 3, then 2, then 1. The night before, she sat at the kitchen table after everyone else was asleep and went through the numbered documents one last time in the lamplight, not because she'd missed anything she hadn't, but because it was the only way she knew to quiet the part of her mind that kept presenting her with worst-case scenarios. She knew what Crow's lawyers would do. They would start with her. They would put her accusation on record in the courtroom and lay it out and watch the room's reaction to it. They would call her motivation into question. They would describe Darby as a compromised witness. They would argue that the original land grant was superseded by the legal amendments. They would be precise and expensive and prepared, and Alden would put up the documents. One by one, the original grant, the amendments, the Finch signatures, the Pruitt receipts, Darby's copies, the payment notation with Crow's initials in her uncle's handwriting. And she would sit in that courtroom and let Crow's lawyers say what they were going to say about her. And she would not look away from it, and she would not apologize for the fact that she was the one who had built the case that was dismantling a 10-year scheme. She closed the portfolio and sat for a while with her hands flat on top of it. Then she went to bed and slept 5 straight hours, which was the best she'd slept since Virginia. The hearing was in the morning. She was ready. The territorial courthouse in Helena was a stone building that smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the particular cold that stone holds even in summer. Maribel had been inside it once before, briefly, when she and Elias had passed through on their way to the land office. It had seemed unremarkable then. It did not seem unremarkable now. She arrived with Elias and Alden 40 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, which was Alden's requirement. He had been precise about it. 40 minutes, he'd said, because you need time to sit in the room before the other side arrives, to let it become ordinary before it becomes a battleground. She had thought that was the kind of thing old lawyers said that sounded wise, but was probably just habit. Sitting in the courtroom now, watching the light come in through the high windows and settle on the empty benches, she understood that he was right. Darby was already there when they came in. He was sitting in the gallery with Alden's colleague, a quiet man named Pressler, who had the competent, unremarkable manner of someone who did solid work without requiring anyone to notice. Darby looked pale and had not slept well. She caught his eye and nodded once, and he straightened slightly in his seat. Margaret Pruitt had come. Maribel had not asked her to, had specifically told her she did not need to attend, that her receipts were already in the record, and her presence was not required. Margaret had sent word back that she was coming anyway, because Carl had paid those fees for 7 years, and he was dead, and someone from the Pruitt family was going to be in the room when it was accounted for. She sat 3 rows back in the gallery in her good dress, with her hands folded in her lap. Hank had driven up from Red Willow the day before. He was in the gallery on the other side of the aisle from Margaret, sitting with his hat on his knee, looking like a man prepared to wait as long as it took. Crow arrived with 2 lawyers. They were Helena men, she could tell by their clothes, and by the way they moved through the courthouse, as if they owned a portion of it. Crow himself looked exactly as he had in Elias's yard 4 days ago. He sat at the table across the aisle without looking at her, which she understood was itself a performance. His lead lawyer was a man named Stafford. She had heard the name from Alden, who had described him as thorough, well-resourced, and not above using personal information as a courtroom weapon. He set his documents on the table and looked across at Alden's materials, and his expression registered nothing, which told her he'd been briefed on what to expect and had prepared accordingly. Judge Warren Cale entered at 9 in the morning, and the room stood. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who had been keeping order in territorial courts long enough that very little surprised him, and very little impressed him either. He sat, arranged his papers, looked at both tables, and said, "We're here on a title dispute filed by Ironwood Land and Development against the Blackwood Ranch property in Red Willow Valley. Counsel ready?" Both sides confirmed they were. Stafford went first. He was good. She had to give him that. He laid out Crow's position in clean, confident language. The boundary amendments had been properly filed with the county recorder, had been approved through the established process, had stood unchallenged for over a decade. The Blackwood family had operated under the amended boundaries for the entire period, had made payments consistent with their acknowledgement of the adjusted property line, and had not disputed the record at any point until very recently. He framed Elias's challenge as a belated attempt to undo a legal process, simply because the outcome was inconvenient. Then he turned to Maribel. He didn't attack her directly at first. He was too experienced for that. He built it up the way a careful man builds something he wants to last, starting with the fact that the primary investigator behind this challenge was a newcomer to the territory, then establishing that she had arrived under disputed circumstances, then introducing the Virginia accusation as a matter of public record, framing it as relevant context for evaluating the reliability of the evidence she had assembled. The court should be aware, Stafford said, that the individual responsible for organizing the evidentiary challenge to our client's filing is herself the subject of a formal fraud accusation in the state of Virginia, a charge of falsifying business financial records. We submit that this context is directly relevant to the credibility of financial documents she has collected and organized. Judge Cale looked at Alden, counselor. Alden rose. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, without apology for his age or his pace. He set both hands on the table and looked at the judge. "We will address the Virginia matter directly," he said. "And when we do, the court will find that the accusation, Mr. Stafford references was itself a fraudulent act, committed by an individual whose financial connection to Ironwood Land and Development is documented in the materials before this court." He paused. "We request the opportunity to present our evidence in full before the court forms any conclusions about the reliability of the party who assembled it." Cale nodded. "Proceed." Alden presented it in the order she had built. The original land grant first, Chester Blackwood, June 1871, full riparian rights to the near bank of Clear Creek, certified copy from the Territorial Land Office, authenticated by the clerk who had overseen the original filing and who had provided a written statement confirming its accuracy. He read the boundary description into the record in its entirety, slowly, so that every measurement and marker was part of the official transcript. Then the amendments. He laid them on the clerk's table one at a time and walked the court through each one, the 1,874 filing that moved the eastern boundary 40 yards west, the 1,876 confirmation that treated the First Amendment as established precedent, and the signature block on each. He named Finch. He entered into the record the employment history, showing that Finch had been hired by the Red Willow County Recorder's Office in 1873, 1 year before the First Amendment, and had resigned abruptly in the spring of 1885, following which his whereabouts were unknown. Stafford objected twice during this section. Both objections were overruled. Then the pattern evidence. 5 other properties along the creek corridor, each with boundary amendments, filed during the same period, each bearing the same secondary approval signature. Maribel had numbered and cross-referenced every document, and Alden moved through them with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent the last 9 days memorizing a sequence he trusted completely. The prut receipts came next 7 years of quarterly payments, all described as easement assessments, all paid to Ironwood Land and Development for an easement that did not exist in any legitimate document. She watched Stafford's face during the Pruett receipts. He had prepared for them, she could tell, because his expression didn't change, which is what preparedness looks like. But the two men sitting behind him, Crow's business associates she assumed, were less experienced at it. One of them leaned forward and wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it toward Stafford. Stafford didn't look at it. Crow sat perfectly still. Then Alden set Darby's portfolio on the clerk's table. He introduced Darby first. Darby took the stand and Pressler guided him through it, his position at the Hartwell business, his period of employment under Gerald Hartwell, the nature of the records he had kept and copied. When Pressler finished, Stafford stood for cross-examination, and Maribel watched him try the angles she had predicted. Darby's motivation, his delay in coming forward, his relationship with Maribel, his qualifications to evaluate financial records. Darby answered each one the way Alden had told him to plainly, without embellishment, without defending himself more than the question required. When Stafford pushed on the delay, Darby said what he'd said in the hotel room in Helena, that he had been afraid, and had told himself it wasn't his fight, and had stayed too long in a situation that cost him pieces of himself, and that Miss Hartwell's letter had arrived, and he had understood that he was running out of time to be the person he wanted to be. The room was quiet when he said it. Stafford moved on quickly, which told her the answer had landed somewhere he hadn't wanted it to. Then Alden entered the copied ledgers. He walked the court through the pre-death records Maribel's handwriting, 4 years of consistent, documented, receipt-matched bookkeeping. Then Gerald's post-death records. Then page 14. He read the notation aloud. Survey coordination fee I. LD per SC arrangement. He looked up at the judge. ILD, he said. Ironwood Land and Development. SC, Silas Crow. The room made a sound, not loud. The collective small shift of a group of people registering something. Stafford was on his feet. The court has no evidence that those initials refer to. We have 3 additional documents, Alden said, without raising his voice, in which Gerald Hartwell spells the name in full in his own correspondence. The letters are in the portfolio. He set them on the clerk's table. Additionally, we have cross-referenced the payment amounts and descriptions in the Hartwell ledgers against the payment records from the Blackwood Ranch. The language is identical. The amounts follow the same quarterly pattern. The Hartwell records precede the Blackwood records by 14 months, indicating that the same operational template was applied to multiple targets. Stafford stood still for a moment. He sat down. Crow had not moved. His posture had not changed. But something around him had changed the particular stillness of a man who is no longer calculating victory, who is now only calculating what remains to be controlled. Judge Cale asked Stafford if he wished to call witnesses. Stafford called one, a county surveyor who testified that boundary amendments were a routine part of territorial land management and did not by themselves indicate fraud. It was a technically accurate statement that did nothing at all to address what had been put before the court, and Alden declined to cross-examine because there was nothing in the testimony worth spending time on. Stafford rested. Alden made his closing argument in 11 minutes. He did not overstate, he did not perform. He simply summarized what the documents showed: an original valid land grant, a falsified amendment process, a decade of fraudulent easement collection, and a financial connection that extended the scheme beyond Montana into at least one other state. He asked the court to restore the original boundary, dismiss the title challenge, and refer the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation. He sat down. The judge took a recess. She sat in the courtroom during the recess and did not speak to anyone. Elias sat beside her and also did not speak, and that was exactly right. Hank brought her a cup of water at some point and set it on the table without comment and went back to the gallery. She drank the water and looked at the wall and waited. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Judge Cale returned, he sat and arranged his papers and looked at both tables and said, "I've reviewed the primary documents submitted by the challenging party. The original land grant is clear and properly authenticated. The boundary amendments filed in 1,874 and 1,876 contain procedural irregularities that this court finds sufficient to question their validity. The pattern of similar amendments across 6 properties during the same period, combined with the financial records, demonstrating a consistent scheme of fraudulent easement collection, establishes grounds for the relief requested." He paused. "The title challenge filed by Ironwood Land and Development is dismissed. The Blackwood Ranch boundary is restored to the description contained in the original 1,871 grant. including full riparian rights to the near bank of Clear Creek. The altered county records for all 6 identified properties are referred to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for investigation. The financial records establishing a connection between Ironwood Land and Development and Gerald Hartwell of Harrisburg, Virginia, are additionally referred to the Attorney General for review. He looked up from his papers. This court further notes for the record that the fraud accusation against Miss Maribel Hartwell, raised in the filings of the opposing counsel, is directly contradicted by the financial documentation entered into evidence today. No finding of fraud against Miss Hartwell is supportable on the basis of the available record. Any such accusation should be understood in light of the documented relationship between the accuser and the fraudulent scheme this court has found sufficient grounds to investigate. He set down his papers. We're adjourned. He stood and left the room. The sound that came up from the gallery was not a cheer exactly. It was the sound of people who had been holding their breath, releasing it all at once. Maribel sat very still. She was aware of Elias beside her. She was aware of Hank in the gallery making a sound she'd never heard from him before. She was aware of Margaret Pruitt, who was not making any sound at all, just sitting with her hands still folded in her lap and her eyes bright. Crow left without speaking. His lawyers gathered their documents with the efficient, expressionless manner of men who had lost, and would file the loss away and move to the next case. Stafford paused briefly at the edge of the table as if he might say something to Alden, and then decided against it and walked out. Alden collected his papers slowly and set them in his case and snapped the latch shut and looked at Maribel. "You built that," he said. "We built it," she said. He shook his head slightly. "I've tried a lot of cases. The ones that hold up are the ones where someone understood the evidence well enough to make it tell a story a judge could follow. That was your work." He picked up his case. "The Attorney General's office is going to want to talk to you, both about the Montana properties and about the Virginia connection. I'd suggest you let them come to you rather than chasing the process." "How long?" she asked. "Investigation like this?" "A year, maybe more. But the referral is in the record now. It doesn't go away." He shook her hand, which she hadn't expected, and then he shook Elias's hand, and then he walked out of the courtroom with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had done what he came to do. She sat in the empty courtroom for a few minutes after everyone else had moved to the corridor, not because she needed to cry or compose herself, but because she wanted to feel the room while it was still to let the 40 minutes of the recess, and the judge's words and the sound from the gallery settle into something she could carry forward without spilling it. She had been carrying the weight of Virginia for months. The accusation, the bruise, the $9.40, the rope-bound suitcase, the doors that closed before she finished asking the question. She had carried all of it, and she had kept working, because working was the only thing she knew that was completely hers, that nobody could take without her consent. That paid back exactly what she put into it. And now the judge had said, in a courtroom, in a territorial record that would not disappear, that the accusation against her was not supportable, that the person who had made it was himself implicated in a fraud, that she had been right about everything she had known to be right about, and the fact that nobody had believed her at the time did not change what was true. She stood up. She walked out of the courtroom. Elias was in the corridor. He was standing a little apart from Hank and Darby and Margaret and Pressler, and when she came through the door, he looked at her with that reading expression of his, the one she'd spent weeks learning, and she looked back at him. And they stood like that for a moment in the corridor of the Helena courthouse, while the sound of the other conversations moved around them. "Alden was right," Elias said quietly. "You built that." "Stop," she said. "I'm not going to stop," he said. He said it without heat, just firmly. "You arrived at my ranch with a bruise on your face, and $9 and a tied-up suitcase, and in 8 weeks you did something that I had been trying to figure out how to do for 3 years, and couldn't." He paused. "That deserves to be said plainly." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "It's been said." "Good," he said. And that was that. They ate supper in Helena that night, all of them together, Hank and Darby and Margaret Pruitt and Pressler and Alden, who had been persuaded to come on the basis that he hadn't eaten a proper meal since the filing deadline. It was a loud, imperfect meal at a long table in a dining room that was too small for the party and too warm from the kitchen, and Hank told a story about the gray mare that had Maribel genuinely laughing, and Darby drank 1 glass of wine and fell asleep in his chair before the dessert course. And Margaret Pruitt talked about Carl for the first time without her voice going tight, and Alden ate 3 courses and pretended he hadn't. Elias sat across from her and was mostly quiet, which was his nature, but he was present in the way she had learned to read him, attentive, taking it in, not somewhere else. She thought, sitting at that table, about the morning she had walked into his yard, with the rope-bound suitcase and the bruised face, and the prepared speech about what she could do. She had been so careful with that speech, so deliberate. She had been trying to make herself sound useful enough to get through one more door before the money ran out. She had not expected to stay. She had not expected that staying would become the first real choice she'd made in years, rather than the best available option in a sequence of closures. There was a difference. She'd learned that in Montana, at a desk in a ranch office by lamplight, with ledger books spread open, and the questions larger than she'd anticipated, and no guarantee that any of it was going to come out right. The difference was between surviving a situation and building something inside it. You could survive for a long time on determination and arithmetic, and the refusal to let anyone see how tired you were. A lot of people did exactly that. She had done it. But building required something additional. It required you to let the place become yours, to invest in it not because you had to, but because you wanted what it could become, and to accept that wanting something meant it could also hurt you if it went wrong. She had let herself want this, the ranch, the case, the creek restored to Elias's land where it belonged. Hank's gradual, honest change of mind. Margaret Pruitt's tin box full of 7 years of proof. Darby, ink-stained and frightened and finally honest. She had let herself want all of it, and it had come out right, and that terrified her a little even now, because the part of her that learned to protect itself from outcomes kept waiting for the reversal. It didn't come. They drove back to Red Willow over 2 days, and on the second morning, coming over the last rise before the valley opened up, she saw the ranch below the house, the barn, the long fence lines, and past the eastern boundary, the thin silver line of Clear Creek catching the morning light. It was theirs, legally, clearly, permanently on paper. The creek that Chester Blackwood had claimed in 1871 and paid for and lost access to through a falsified record was restored by a territorial court order that would stand as long as the record stood. She looked at it for a long moment. Elias had stopped the wagon at the top of the rise. Not deliberately, the horses had slowed on the grade, and he'd let them. But she thought afterward that maybe it wasn't entirely accidental. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. He looked at the creek and then at her and said, "I want to ask you something." She turned to look at him. The morning was clear and cold, and the light was still coming in at the low angle that made the valley look like something someone had painted. "Ask it," she said. "Stay," he said. "Not because the ranch needs a housekeeper, not because of the case, or because you have nowhere else to go. Because," he stopped. He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture he used when his mind was working ahead of his words. "Because you've been here 8 weeks, and this place is different than it was. And I'm different than I was. And I don't think that goes away if you leave. But I think something important does." She looked at him for a long time. She had thought about this. Not in the way of planning or anticipating. She was too practical for that kind of forward dreaming. But she had noticed, in the way you notice things you're not ready to examine directly, that she had stopped calculating how long her money would last. She had stopped doing the arithmetic of temporary situations. She had started without acknowledging it until this moment, thinking about the ranch in the spring, what the kitchen garden could produce, whether the barn's eastern wall would hold through another winter or need addressing before the cold came. She had been thinking like someone who was staying. "I'm not leaving because I have nowhere to go," she said. "I have options now. Alden said the Attorney General's office will want to talk to me. There may be work from that. There are other places." "I know," he said. "I'm staying because I want to," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I understand the distinction," he said. He said it with a particular steadiness that she had come to understand was not distance, but its opposite. A man who said less than most people because he meant everything he said. "Then yes," she said. "I'm staying." He nodded once and looked back at the valley and clicked the horses forward down the grade toward the ranch. It was not a dramatic conclusion to the conversation. There was no reaching across the wagon bench, no declaration. There was just the fact of it, settled between them in the morning light, on a road coming down toward a property, with its boundaries finally restored. That was its own kind of enough. The weeks that followed were ordinary in the best sense of the word. The work of the ranch continued. The The creek was accessible again without legal ambiguity, and Elias began planning the water management that had been impossible before a small diversion for the kitchen garden, a reliable source for the stock through summer, the kind of long-term thinking that had been foreclosed as long as the boundary was in dispute. Hank ran the planning conversations with the focused energy of a man who had been waiting to have them for years. Darby went back to Virginia. He had testified to the Attorney General's representative before leaving Helena and had given the same statement he'd given in the courtroom, and the representative had taken his information and the copies and said the investigation would proceed. What would happen to Gerald Hartwell was not something Maribel could control, and she had made her peace with that. The record was in the record. The truth was documented. What justice looked like in practice was the territory's concern now, not hers. She wrote Darby a letter before he left. Not a long one. She thanked him for coming. She told him that what he'd done had mattered, and that she knew it had cost him something to do it, and that the cost didn't make it less right, only more real. She told him to find better work than whatever Gerald offered him when he got back, because he was smart enough to have options, and he should use them. He wrote back 6 weeks later. He had found a position at a law firm in Harrisburg as a junior clerk. The firm had heard there was an investigation connected to Gerald Hartwell and had offered Darby the position specifically because of his knowledge of the records involved. He said it was better work, and the hours were reasonable, and the senior partner had not yet, in 3 weeks, struck anyone. He said this in a way that suggested he understood the bar was low but was grateful for it anyway. She kept the letter in the tin she'd brought from Virginia. It had very little in it besides the original letter from Thomas Alden and $12 that she hadn't needed to spend. Margaret Pruitt came for supper one Sunday, in the month after the hearing, and she and Maribel sat on the porch afterward while the light went long across the valley, and Margaret said, "The easement payments stop." "Yes," Maribel said. "As of the court order, nobody in the corridor owes Crow anything." "Abel Weatherby's been sick," Margaret said. "His wife Dora manages mostly alone." Those payments they were real money, the kind of money that decides whether you replace a roof or not. "I know. Will the Attorney General's investigation recover any of it? What was paid wrongfully?" Maribel thought about that honestly. "I don't know. Maybe. The referral is in the record and the financial trail exists. Whether the territory pursues it and whether they can collect." She stopped. "I would not plan around it." Margaret looked at the valley. "Carl would have been angry," she said quietly. He was a slow man to anger, but when it came, it was real. 7 years of payments for a lie. She shook her head. He trusted the county paperwork. He had no reason not to. "I know." A pause. "But I think about what I told him. That I didn't know. That he should trust the paperwork. I could have looked at it myself. I chose not to because it wasn't my area." She pressed her lips together. "I won't make that mistake again with my own land. If you want to understand the records better," Maribel said, "I can show you what to look for." Margaret turned to look at her. "You'd do that?" "I'll come over one afternoon," Maribel said. "Bring the records, and we'll go through them together. I can show you how to read a boundary description and how to check it against the county record. It's not complicated once someone walks you through it the first time." Margaret looked at her for a moment with the direct, assessing gaze that Maribel had noticed the first day she'd knocked on that door. "You're not what I expected," Margaret said. "When I first saw you, doing laundry. What did you expect?" "Someone passing through," Margaret said. The same words Hank had used. "Someone who needed work temporarily." "I needed work," Maribel said. That part was accurate. "But you weren't temporary." "No," Maribel said. "I wasn't." She and Elias married in Red Willow in October, when the aspen on the ridge had gone yellow and the air had the particular sharp quality of Montana fall. It was not a large event. The judge from Red Willow presided. Hank stood beside Elias. Margaret Pruitt sat in the front row with her 2 sons, who were taller than she'd expected from Margaret's descriptions. Ruiz brought his wife, a quiet woman who shook Maribel's hand with both of hers and said something in Spanish that Ruiz translated as "welcome to your own life," which Maribel thought was the best wedding message she could have received from anyone. Greer from the hotel came, which surprised her. He sat in the back and left quickly after, but he came. She thought he had probably come because not coming would have required him to actively choose to get it, and whatever recalculation he'd done of Maribel Hartwell since the hearing had made that a harder choice than it once would have been. Several people she didn't know by name came because word traveled in a small valley, and the story of what had happened in the Helena courtroom had traveled further than she'd expected. She heard versions of it back from people she'd never spoken to, some accurate, some embellished, one that made her sound considerably more dramatic than she had actually been. She didn't correct them. The truth was in the record. The stories people told around it were their own. The autumn afternoon was cold, and the ceremony was short, and afterward they ate at the ranch. All of them crowded into the house that Maribel had organized room by room in her first weeks there. Hank made a toast that was 3 sentences long and entirely sincere, and was the best toast she'd ever heard. Later, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet, she stood on the porch in the cold dark and looked out at the property, the fence lines barely visible, the barn outlined against the sky, and in the distance the sound of the creek. She could hear it clearly now. The bounce restored, the water moving over rock the way it always had, regardless of what any piece of paper said. She had been thinking lately about something Alden had said during one of their preparation sessions, almost as an aside, something that wasn't about the case at all. He'd said that in 31 years of territorial law he'd seen a lot of people fight for what was theirs, and the ones who succeeded were almost never the ones who fought loudest or hardest. They were the ones who understood the difference between the truth and the story people believed, and who were patient enough to close that gap, one document at a time. She'd thought about that often in the months since. She had arrived in Montana with nothing that most people would recognize as power. No money to speak of, no connections, no legal standing, no family name that meant anything in this territory. The only things she'd brought were the ability to read what numbers actually said, the willingness to follow a pattern wherever it led, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been told for too long that she was less than she was and had stopped believing it. She had not been naive enough to think those things would be sufficient. She had been afraid, more times than she'd shown anyone, that the gap between what she knew and what she could prove would be too wide to cross. She had lain awake counting documents and recounting them, and running scenarios for how Crow's lawyers would attack each one. She had written the summary page at the front of the portfolio 3 times before she was satisfied it would hold. None of it had been easy. None of it had been certain. But she had learned, in a ranch office in Montana by lamplight, that doing the work didn't guarantee the outcome. It guaranteed only that you had done everything within your reach, and that whatever came after you could stand behind. There was more comfort in that than she'd expected. Certainty turned out to be a less solid thing than honesty about what you didn't know. And she had learned something else, something simpler and harder to explain. She had learned the difference between a place you stay, because there is nowhere else, and a place you stay because it is yours. She had lived in the first kind for most of her life, her father's house, which she loved but which would never have been fully hers, the boarding house in Red Willow, which was never going to be anything but temporary. She had not known what the second kind felt like until she stood in the yard of this ranch one cold morning and looked at the fence lines and the barn and the distant creek, and felt, for the first time in years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That feeling was not magic. It was not a signal from somewhere outside herself. It was the simple recognition that she had made choices, hard ones, costly ones, choices that had required her to be afraid and keep working anyway, that had brought her to this specific place, and that the place was better for her presence, and that she was better for having built something in it rather than just survived it. She heard the door behind her open. Elias came out and stood beside her on the porch. He looked out at the property in the dark, the way she had been looking at it, not checking on it, just being present with it, the way you are with something you've worked to keep. Cold, he said. Yes, she said. They stood there for a while. The creek was audible in the quiet, moving through the dark toward wherever creeks went. She had a name that was clean now, a home that was hers in the way that mattered, not by inheritance or luck, but by work and by choice, and by the willingness to follow a pattern of documents through a records office and into a courtroom and stand in front of it and say, this is what the numbers actually say, and not to stop until someone with the authority to make it matter had heard it and agreed. It was enough, more than enough. She looked out at the valley and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the uncomplicated satisfaction of a life that was actually hers, not the one she'd been handed, not the one someone else had tried to reduce her to, but the one she had found by walking through the last door that opened and refusing, from that day forward, to make herself smaller than she was.